a crown stained in blood. It began, as these things often do, not with thunder or swordplay, but with silence. A silence so thick it seemed to seep into the very stones of the royal palace. Just before dawn, when the servants still whispered to the walls and the torches burned low, a body was discovered. Not just any body, but the crowned heir to the kingdom, young, brilliant, adored by the court and the people alike, now lying lifeless in his chamber. His death would mark the beginning of the most mysterious royal murder in recorded history, one that has defied explanation for centuries. The room was sealed from the inside, no windows broken, no guards heard anything, and yet there he was, sprawled across crimson-soaked bedsheets, eyes wide open, lips slightly parted as if trying to speak a final truth no one would ever hear. The candle at his bedside was still burning, a fire that knew more than any of the living. His name was Prince Alaric, first son of King Theodoric II, and the hope of a realm that had only recently clawed its way back from civil unrest. At 24, he had already toured the outer provinces, diffused a northern rebellion without bloodshed, and earned the adoration of foreign dignitaries for his sense of justice and disarming charm. His coronation was expected within the year. But now, silence. What followed in the hours after the discovery was not a flurry of justice, but something altogether colder, a methodical cover-up. The royal council met behind closed doors, the castle gates were barred, no proclamations were issued. The official announcement came a full day later, and even then it was vague. The crown mourns the sudden passing of His Grace, Prince Alaric, who died peacefully in his sleep. Peacefully. The court physician, summoned in the earliest hours, noted otherwise in a draft never meant for public eyes. The prince's neck bore Stran. G markings, thin abrasions inconsistent with any known cause of natural death. A small puncture below his ear, barely visible, his fingertips stained faintly with something dark, metallic. And yet, when the autopsy was published, all of it was missing. Declared natural failure of the heart, despite no history, no symptoms, and no signs. Mainstream historians agree on this. The prince died in his bedchamber in the spring of 1284. The chamber doors were locked from the inside. No alarm was raised, and no suspect was ever named. A mystery sealed not just in stone, but in fear. And yet there are fragments, hints, oddities that never settled. One fringe document, copied by a monk in 1623, speaks of a crimson omen witnessed in the night sky above the palace the evening prior. A comet, perhaps, or a blood moon. Others claimed the prince had been plagued by visions in the weeks before, of a woman in black, of wolves at his feet, of an ancient sword buried beneath the throne. The sort of stories the crown dismissed as folklore. But folklore, as we know, has long outlived kings. And then there is the matter of the royal tapestries. The prince's room was adorned with elaborate woven scenes of conquest and divine right, stitched by hand nearly a century before. Most are still intact, but the one hanging over the headboard, the one directly above the prince as he died, was removed within hours, vanished, no record, no replacement. Some say it depicted the fall of a forgotten king, his crown shattered, his blood feeding the roots of a dying tree. To this day, scholars still debate whether Alaric's death was a murder, a misfortune, or something more ceremonial. An old rite, perhaps, a symbolic offering cloaked in modern succession. Theories range from political assassination to poison from a jealous lover. Others, far more cryptic, speak of a bloodline curse traced back to the founding of the dynasty, a pact made in secret, honoured in death. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. This story, this tragedy, is not just about one death, it's about what followed, about the web of silence spun by a court that feared the truth more than chaos, about the lives upended, the documents destroyed, the confessions hidden in abbeys and foreign courts, and about the single question that echoed through stone halls and blood-stained scrolls for over 7 centuries: who killed Prince Alaric? The crown, after all, still rests on a throne built atop that very silence. The chamber with no witnesses. The prince's bedchamber was not merely a room, it was a fortress within a fortress. Built deep inside the inner sanctum of the royal palace, its walls were 2 feet thick, its windows narrow and barred, and its doors secured with iron bolts and internal locks. It was a sanctuary designed for absolute safety, a place where even whispers struggled to find purchase. And on that fateful night, no one entered, at least according to the records. But the scene that greeted the guards that morning told a different story. The first to find him was Sir Hamric, the prince's personal shieldman. He knocked, then called, then pounded on the thick oak door when there was no reply, no answer. When the chamberlain was summoned to unlock it with the master key, the bolts inside were still drawn. Somehow, someone, or something, had killed the prince and vanished, leaving everything sealed. And yet, the room was not undisturbed. The bedding was torn, as if from a brief struggle. A glass goblet lay shattered near the hearth, a faint trace of liquid soaked into the carpet. His sword remained in its sheath, untouched. Most striking of all, a single smear of blood led from the edge of the bed to the foot of the hearth, ending abruptly. No footprints, no second cup, no opened window, just one locked room, one dead air, and a silence that swallowed explanation. Modern forensics, if applied, would have cried for further study. But this was the 13th century. The royal physician, a learned man named Galen de Morvan, arrived in a panic. He ordered the room sealed and examined the body alone. His official account was careful, even poetic. A peaceful death, spared pain, his noble features untouched by fear. But his private notes, unearthed nearly 400 years later in a monastery's attic, were far less serene. Skin pale, yet warm, no rigour, puncture at base of noun. Unusual discoloration in eyes, grey film over iris, tongue swollen, markings along wrists like bands or clasps, no sign of vomit or seizure, door locked, window barred. Something is missing, something I cannot name. This, from a physician who had treated plague victims and battlefield wounds alike. And then there was the final line, hastily scribbled in the corner. He was not alone. That note was never submitted to the council. To further complicate matters, the room was scrubbed clean within hours. The prince's body was moved to the crypt before sundown. His belongings were either burned or archived, depending on their nature. And most curiously, the chamber was bricked over just 3 days later, under the direction of Lord Chancellor Evandrel. He claimed it was for sanctity and peace. Others saw it as erasure. Still, fragments remained. The guards on duty swore under oath they had seen no one enter or exit, but one maid, a 17-year-old named Lisette, claimed she heard music coming from the chamber well after midnight. A soft, mournful tune on a single-stringed instrument. She said it sounded like a lullaby, but wrong, as though played backward. She was dismissed from service 2 days later and never seen again. Centuries later, during renovations in 1834, masons uncovered part of the old bedchamber's wall behind the stonework. Etched faintly into the wood panels were lines of what appeared to be ancient script, runic, possibly, or an esoteric cipher lost to time. One line, however, had been translated: "What is bound by breath must be broken in blood." Scholars still debate whether this inscription predates the murder or was carved that very night. Others suggest it was left by whoever, or whatever, was in that room. One curious detail, often glossed over in traditional accounts: a candelabrum was found still lit, but the wax from 2 of its 6 arms was untouched, while the others had burned low. If true, it implies that something, someone, replaced the candles or lit them after the others had long begun to melt. A small, strange discrepancy, but one that casts doubt on the idea of uninterrupted sleep leading to death. There were no witnesses, and yet the chamber seemed to scream with the evidence of something unspeakable. In a kingdom that had weathered war, betrayal, and famine, the death of its heir should have triggered a public mourning of grand proportions, but instead it triggered a kind of hush, like the deep breath before a scream that never comes. We must wonder what could be so terrible, so destabilizing, that a royal family would choose mystery over mourning, secrecy over justice. Perhaps the answer lies not in who killed Prince Alaric, but in how, a kingdom on edge, the days that followed the prince's death were not filled with the clamour of sorrow or public weeping, as one might expect from the loss of a beloved heir. Instead, the palace and its surrounding city sank into something else, something quieter, more dangerous. Fear. Word of Alaric's death spread not through proclamations but through glances, through servants who wouldn't speak unless the drapes were drawn, through the merchants who noticed armed guards doubling at the city gates. The capital city, once filled with song and market bells, grew subdued. Noble families began to send urgent letters to distant cousins, and some quietly moved their children out of court. They didn't know what had happened inside the palace walls, but they knew something had. At court, the corridors filled with suspicion. The king, Theodoric II, appeared once in public shortly after the death. He said nothing, just stood at the top of the palace steps, his face like stone, hands clasped behind his back, eyes hollow. Then he vanished from view for nearly a week. Behind closed doors, the council scrambled. The question was never only what happened, but what it meant. The death of a young, capable prince with no clear suspect did more than damage the royal family. It tore at the very idea of divine favour. In this medieval kingdom, kings were not merely men, they were gods chosen on earth. Their heirs were symbols of continuity, of heaven's approval. So a prince slain in the sanctum of royal protection, with no enemy to blame and no clear crime to prosecute, was something deeply destabilizing. If the crown could not protect its own, what could it protect at all? Noble houses began to posture. The Duke of Venhelm was the first to openly question the safety of succession, suggesting that perhaps new protocols were needed, coded language for challenging the line. The Marchioness of Stra offered prayers for the purity of the royal line, which, in context, was less pious than poisonous. And in the southern provinces, rumours emerged of minor lords mustering more men than necessary for harvest protection. The kingdom was slipping, not into war, but into fracture. Quiet, diplomatic fracture, the kind that creeps like ivy through the walls of empires. Mainstream records confirm this turbulence. Letters between ambassadors from the Holy League of Ten express concern over confusion in the court of Theodoric II. One even notes the odd increase of northern spies in the capital, an event not officially acknowledged until decades later. And then came the first strange proclamation. All mirrors in the palace were to be removed. Why? No explanation. But within days, every reflecting surface was either broken or carried out under armed supervision. One servant, in a letter smuggled to her sister, wrote, "They say the prince saw something in the glass the night before. They say it was not his own reflection." That fringe anecdote has long fueled speculation. Some argue it hints at hallucination from poisoning, others whisper of omens or supernatural interference. Even today, no single theory holds consensus. But the fear was real. In fact, a little-known but verified act passed by the King's Privy Council just days after the death imposed curfews within the capital for the first time in decades. No one was allowed in or out of the palace complex after sunset. Watchmen were doubled, horses were barred from the central courtyard where the prince's window overlooked. Perhaps the most chilling moment came a week later when the cathedral bells were silenced. Not just for mourning, silenced indefinitely. The Archbishop himself decreed it. When questioned, he merely said, "No more echoes," a phrase which appears in a handful of sources and yet has never been fully explained. What echoes? Of the prince's death? Or something else entirely? The state began to crack under the strain of mystery. Some wanted answers, others wanted scapegoats. One fringe noble, Lady Calistine of Rismere, publicly accused the king's advisor, High Chancellor Evandrel, of orchestrating the murder to place a puppet on the throne. She was found dead 3 nights later in her own estate, her journal mysteriously missing a week's worth of entries. Scholars still debate whether her death was coincidence or conspiracy. But the cracks were spreading, not through swordplay, not through open rebellion, but through paranoia. The idea that something invisible, something untouchable, had slipped into the palace and taken the future of the realm without so much as a broken lock. And it wasn't just the palace. In the months after the prince's death, whispers of strange occurrences multiplied throughout the kingdom. A monastery in the Highlands claimed a statue of St. Elric bled from the eyes. A merchant swore that his silver tarnished black overnight after passing near the castle, and a child born in the city square was said to have spoken the word "return" on its first breath. All dismissed by the court, of course, but when fear takes root, it doesn't need truth, only space, and the silence left in Prince Alaric's place was cavernous. The heir who wasn't ready. With Prince Alaric dead, the line of succession shifted with a jolt, not smoothly, not cleanly, but with the dull clang of a blade striking crooked metal. The crown was never meant for his younger brother, Prince Corwin, and everyone knew it. Corwin was 20 years old at the time, bookish, quiet, often described as pale and withdrawn, with a stammer that grew worse under pressure. Where Alaric was fire, Corwin was smoke, harder to grasp, easier to overlook. He was the second son, born not with expectations, but with apologies. No one had ever truly prepared him to rule, not even Corwin himself. But within a fortnight of the funeral, he was being fitted for the ceremonial crown. On the surface, it was a dutiful transition. The court assured the public that continuity would be honoured, that the young prince had been raised in the same traditions and would serve with the same strength. But beneath the polished words and tightened smiles, the court buzzed with unease. Corwin's first public address was short, strained. He read from a vellum scroll with trembling hands. "I accept this solemn duty with grief in my heart and loyalty to my people." A clean sentiment, delivered in a cracked voice. He stumbled over his brother's name. Some whispered that he had never mourned, not truly. Others whispered darker things, that he had no need to. Mainstream records agree on the facts. Corwin was swiftly named heir presumptive and groomed for coronation. Preparations began even before Alaric's official tomb was completed. But what the records don't show is the extraordinary effort taken by the royal advisers to shield Corwin from inquiry, scrutiny, or even dialogue about his brother's death. All questions were deflected. All invitations to foreign courts were postponed. And in the most curious twist, Corwin was never again permitted to sleep in the royal palais. He was relocated to a summer manor on the southern coast, where he remained under guarded retreat for 3 full seasons. Officially, this was for his health, but one fringe letter from a minor court scribe named Dervin Dulot, never published in its time, claimed that Corwin had woken screaming each night for a week after the prince's passing, refusing to speak of what he'd dreamed, only muttering about fire behind the mirrors and voices beneath the floor. This detail, dismissed for centuries as overwrought gossip, was oddly echoed in a letter from a nun at the Abbey of St. Kenneth. She wrote, "The new heir has been marked by shadow, they say. One of the Queen's old ladies told us he walks as if the halls whisper behind him. Scholars still debate whether Corwin's retreat was protection or containment." Then came the matter of his coronation ring. Tradition demanded a sigil ring made with iron from the same source used in forging the sword of state. Yet Corwin's ring, when finally unveiled, bore a different composition. Alchemical testing in the 19th century showed traces of meteoric iron, a rare, otherworldly material sometimes associated in medieval lore with fallen stars and divine portents. Who chose the metal? No one knows. The royal jeweller of the time left no surviving ledgers. Was it a gesture of uniqueness, or a symbolic tether to something ancient? One cannot ignore the shifting behaviour of Corwin's court. In the years that followed, many of Alaric's closest allies were quietly removed. Commander Brecht, who had served the elder prince with distinction, was given an overseas post. The High Almoner was reassigned. Even Alaric's personal falconer, a man of no political consequence, was imprisoned for disobedience, then vanished from record. The replacements all had one thing in common: no prior service to Alaric. It was as though his memory were being softly excised, not defamed, but dissolved, a subtle unwriting of presence. Statues of the elder prince remained, but speeches stopped mentioning him. His tapestries were moved to lesser halls. His motto, "Strength with Mercy," was removed from the banners and replaced with Corwin's own, "Peace is vigilance." And then, of course, there was the Queen. Her relationship with her surviving son grew complicated. Some said distant, others said unnaturally close. What's certain is that she took charge of many court functions herself, operating with a level of visibility she had not previously shown. It was she who issued the decree to burn all personal effects from Alaric's bedchamber, citing divine instruction, and she who approved the controversial bricking of the chamber itself. When pressed, she said only this: "Some doors are not meant to be reopened." To this day, scholars still debate whether Corwin was a puppet, a pawn, or a prince overwhelmed by circumstances too enormous for any one man. Was he complicit or merely convenient? Had he known something or simply feared knowing? A fringe theory gaining quiet traction among some independent historians proposes that Corwin was not supposed to survive the night Alaric died, that both princes had been marked, that whatever came for Alaric had hesitated, or failed, with Corwin. If so, then his reign began not with victory, but with reprieve, and sometimes a reprieve carries its own curse. That night in the East Wing, it was a gusty spring night when Prince Alaric died. Rain like needles against the castle's slate roof, and wind that made even the stone towers groan. Inside the palace, fires crackled behind heavy velvet curtains, servants bustled less, doors stayed latched longer. That kind of night, the kind where secrets travel more easily, cloaked in weather and muffled by thunder. Most of the royal household was accounted for during those hours, but one corridor, the East Wing, remains the subject of quiet obsession among historians and curious minds alike. It was never part of the official investigation. In fact, it was barely mentioned at all. Yet in retrospect, it may hold the key to understanding what truly unfolded. The East Wing was not a residence. It was a transitional corridor used mainly by scribes, couriers, and archivists, a functional hall leading to the royal library, the conservatory, and several lesser chambers that had fallen into disuse. But in the weeks before Alaric's death, multiple members of the court had noticed unusual traffic through that wing. Low-ranking officials staying late, lanterns glimpsed through the frosted glass well past midnight, footsteps when no one had been announced. The king's steward reportedly filed a complaint just days before the murder, noting a repeated presence near the conservator's alcove and requesting an internal audit. That audit never happened. But what draws particular interest are the newly uncovered letters, recently authenticated, that suggest someone not listed among the court registries was present in the palace that night. The letter, written by a court clerk named Morel, was addressed to a cousin in a distant port city. It was never sent, discovered in the lining of a leather trunk generations later. Something strange last night. A man in black robes, not one I've seen before, passed into the east wing without word or guard. I asked the scribe at the door who he was. He paled, said nothing, and turned away. I watched him go, tall, silent, gloved, not a drop of rain on him, though he'd come from outside. And later, when the bells rang for daybreak, I could not find the scribe again. Gone. Just gone. Officially, there is no record of an unknown visitor, no entry in the watch ledgers, no foreign dignitaries registered, and yet Morrell's letter is not alone. Another, from a junior archivist named Seldrin, mentions hearing voices from the east wing, one a whisper, the other a childlike giggle, as though someone were reciting something backwards. Fringe? Perhaps, but the palace's east-facing windows were found unlatched the next morning. The wind had blown pages across the floor of the conservatory and extinguished several candles. Odd, given that those windows were usually locked and bolted from the inside. Only someone with a master key or a knowledge of the old maintenance passages could have accessed them. Mainstream historians tend to dismiss these anomalies. They argue that a castle of such size always has ghosts in its blueprints, stray creaks, misunderstood shadows. But this was not just a night of odd drafts and stormy weather. Something else was moving. The East Wing itself has a curious architectural history. Originally part of the old monastery that predated the palace, it was folded into the new construction during King Theodoric V's reign. But the masonry there is older, different stone, narrower archways, and an unusual acoustical quality. Words travel strangely there, echoes linger. During a restoration in the 17th century, a mason named Rodan Etzer wrote in his journal, "The walls here whisper, truly. I placed my ear to the pillar near the conservatory, and I swear to the Virgin I heard singing." Sceptical, understandably, but even today, visitors to the preserved East Wing, now partially open to the public, remark on the strange atmosphere, cold spots, flickering candlelight, the sense of being watched. One tapestry in particular, hanging at the far end of the East Wing, depicts a curious scene, a cloaked figure offering a crown to a kneeling man. The figure's face is blank, no features, just shadow. Art historians have long debated the origin of the piece. It bears no known signature, and the dyes used in its stitching are not consistent with others from the same era. Scholars still debate whether anyone truly entered the East Wing the night of Alaric's death, or whether the wing was merely a vessel for something else. But perhaps the most chilling detail came from an inventory list dated 2 days after the murder. It was compiled quietly by the Keeper of Scrolls and went unnoticed until uncovered in a university archive centuries later. Among the list of items marked missing was a small object described simply as box, ebony wood, 6 in, brass clasp, unsealed, contents unknown. Removed from shelf 12A, conservator's alcove. Its trail ends there. An object, unsealed. A figure, unknown. A wing, unguarded. And a prince, alone in his room, beneath a tapestry that would vanish forever before the day's end. Perhaps what happened in the East Wing wasn't an intrusion at all. Perhaps it was an invitation. The missing servant. When a royal dies unexpectedly, everything within reach becomes evidence. People, objects, schedules, even silences. But sometimes it's not what's present that tells the story, it's what disappears. Within 24 hours of Prince Alaric's death, an inventory of the royal household was taken, as per custom. Every servant, guard, scribe and steward was accounted for, except one. His name was Rian, or at least that's what the palace rosters called him. Rian had served in the prince's wing for nearly 3 years. He was listed as a junior steward, assigned to linen duty and chamber maintenance. Quiet, punctual, forgettable, no incidents, no commendations. But on the morning of Alaric's death, Rian did not report for his usual duties. By evening his quarters were found empty, his effects removed, his cot unslept in. No trace, no note, no farewell. At first the head of staff assumed he'd fled, perhaps overwhelmed by grief or afraid of being blamed. That happened sometimes. Royal households were crucibles of pressure, and some couldn't bear the heat. But something about Ryan's disappearance was different. His absence triggered no manhunt, no posters, no public inquiries. Instead, something stranger occurred. His name was removed from the record. Within 3 days, updated household ledgers were circulated. Where Rian's name had appeared, a blank space now sat. Payroll entries were voided. The registrar's log was amended by hand. It was as though he had never existed. One curious clerk, Elias Norwin, noted the discrepancy in a margin. Rian, linen rotation, gone, no transfer papers, who struck the line? Elias was reassigned to the grain registry in the Western Provinces a week later. Official histories don't mention Ryan, not even once, but letters from servants, scattered in family chests and university archives, tell a different story. Several remnants embered him, not fondly or unfondly, just as being there, always early, always folding precisely, and always avoiding eye contact. One, a laundry-maid named Haler, recalled that he spoke very little, and that he wore gloves at all times, even in the heat. He said he'd burned his hands in childhood, she wrote, but his movements were delicate, not clumsy, and sometimes, when he thought no one watched, he would trace strange symbols into the soap suds. That would be easy to dismiss, if not for the other details. Another servant claimed to have seen Ryan outside the prince's chamber shortly before dawn, despite having no assigned duties at that hour. He was just standing there, the witness recalled, looking at the door like he was listening. But the most chilling account came decades later from a royal archivist compiling oral testimonies for a chronicle. A former guard, old and blind, remembered Rian's voice. I only heard him once. He was humming, low, tuneless. It made my teeth ache, and when I turned the corner, he was gone. But the door he passed through was still shut. No footsteps, just gone. More unnerving is that Rian's name appears nowhere before 3 years prior to Alaric's death. No baptismal records, no hiring contract, not even a tax record, just a sudden notation. Ryan, linens, as though conjured by pen alone. Scholars still debate whether Ryan was a real person. Some suggest he may have been an alias for a spy, possibly planted by a rival faction to monitor the prince. Others posit something even more unorthodox, that Rian was part of a ritual placeholder, a figure inserted into daily life without origin, meant to observe without interfering, a living symbol perhaps, a vessel. That sounds fanciful, until you read the unfiled letter from the Queen's own chaplain dated 2 days after the murder. The ink is faded, but the passage is clear. There is one among the linen folk whose name I do not dream. This is not a fault of memory, it is absence by design. Absence by design. In the following months, the linen duties were reshuffled. The wing was reassigned. No one asked about Rian again. That might have been the end of his trace, had it not been for a strange discovery made in the cathedral crypts 2 centuries later, during a renovation. Behind a loose panel, restorers found a folded servant's tunic, dust-caked, brittle with age, but unmistakably from the royal household. In its pocket was a fragment of parchment, smeared and half-burned, bearing only one legible line. The sleeper must not wake. Some say the message was poetic, others believe it was literal. Was Ryan merely a vanishing servant, frightened into flight, or something far less ordinary, a placeholder in the tapestry of the court, erased not by accident, but by necessity? In the end, one thing remains clear. On the night of Prince Alaric's death, someone was in the palace who should not have been, someone no longer remembered by name. someone who may never have had one to begin with. The Queen's silence. For all the voices that whispered, accused, and speculated after Prince Alaric's death, one voice was conspicuously missing: the Queen's. Queen Isolde, mother to Alaric, matriarch of the realm. Once known for her eloquence and steel-like resolve, she withdrew into silence so total, so absolute, it became its own kind of scandal. Her last public words were spoken the day before her son's death, during the harvest proclamation. She was reported as serene, even radiant. The morning after, she vanished from sight. The palace issued formal statements. The Queen was grieving in private. She would return to her duties in due time. But days turned to weeks, and the Queen did not reappear. When she finally emerged, it was not to address the court or to mourn publicly, but to attend a mass behind veils so thick her face was hidden from all. She walked unaided but slow, as if the air around her had grown heavy. Rumours swelled. Some said she had suffered a breakdown, that the loss had cracked her mind. Others whispered darker things, that she had known something was coming, or worse, had played a part in it. None could say for certain. What is known is this: Queen Isolde never spoke aloud in public again, not a single word. For the remainder of her reign, 6 long years, she issued decrees only through scribes, sealed with her ring, but penned in an unfamiliar hand. Her closest advisers were dismissed, her old confessor replaced. The royal portraitist, once tasked with capturing her likeness yearly, recorded in his journal, "Her gaze now is the kind I do not wish to preserve. She stares not at you, but through you, as if speaking to something behind your shoulder." The change was not just emotional, it was structural. Court rituals altered subtly. Candles in the Queen's chambers were kept burning day and night. Windows, once open to gardens, were shuttered permanently. Music, once her greatest delight, was banned in her wing, and a new member of her household staff was quietly appointed, a woman named Thera, listed only as a night attendant. Thera was not seen in daylight. Some suspected she was a nurse. Others said she was a spiritual advisor from beyond the realm. A few said nothing at all, because when they tried, the words curdled in their mouths. One page, later dismissed for drunkenness, claimed he once glimpsed Thera leaving the Queen's chamber just before dawn, and described her as wreathed in silver dust. His account ends abruptly there, mid-sentence. Among the most chilling details comes from a gardener named Bram, whose journals were found decades later in a crumbling barn. He wrote, "Every third night, the Queen walks to the reflecting pool. She wears no shoes, no cloak. The guards do not follow. She kneels, speaks without voice, and weeps without tears. Then she stands, and the pool no longer shows her face." He was fired shortly after for impertinent observation. Her silence became doctrine. Poets romanticized it. Philosophers dissected it. But behind closed doors, high-ranking nobles grew uneasy. A monarch who does not speak is one thing. A queen who will not speak, that's something else entirely. Especially when one considers what she did say just before the silence began. A fragment of a letter, torn, unsigned, never delivered, was later found hidden in the binding of a theological treatise in the royal library. Its ink had faded, but the words remained. "He came to me in dream, robed in ash and crow feathers. He said my son had crossed a threshold not meant for blood of mine, that no tomb could hold what stirs beneath. I awoke with blood in my mouth." Many dismissed it as a hoax, but when the Queen finally died, years later, in her sleep, her attending physician noted something strange. Her tongue, long unused, bore scars, as if she had bitten it, repeatedly, over time, not from accident, from restraint. The day of her funeral, the skies blackened unexpectedly. A sudden storm, lightning struck the west tower. No one was injured, but the stone lion above her son's memorial split clean in two. Some said it was coincidence, others said it was the Queen's first and final cry. The boy who saw too much. The night Prince Alaric died, nearly every candle in the royal chapel blew out at once. That's what the boy swore. Not just flickered, but extinguished, as if the very air had been sucked from the room. He was only 11 at the time, a kitchen scullion named Milo, sent on a late errand to fetch figs for the Queen's table. He should never have been near the chapel at all, but he had taken the shortcut through the west cloisters, silent, shadowed, usually empty. That night they were not, and that was how he saw what he saw. Milo was never meant to testify, but someone, no one ever found out who, slipped his name to a minor court scribe. Within days the boy was brought before a chamberlain, then a priest, then a shadowy council of review that met only when matters were too delicate for daylight. They sat him in a cold stone room, handed him warm milk, and asked him to speak plainly. He tried. But some parts of what he described still defy logic. Milo said he first heard the voices, 2 men, urgent, angry, and then one that was colder, older, impossible to place. The third voice, he said, didn't echo like the others. It pressed into the ear like a knife under skin. He peered through the small crevice in the chapel's service door. There, he saw Prince Alaric standing alone beneath the great iron chandelier. No crown, no guards, just him, barefoot, arms out, as if welcoming something. What struck Milo most wasn't the prince's stillness, it was the silence. He said he couldn't hear the prince's breath, couldn't hear the rustle of his robe. Everything in the room seemed suspended, like the hush before a thunderclap. Then, from behind one of the chapel pillars, a second figure stepped into view. Milo had never seen him before. He was tall, hooded, robes trailing the floor like smoke. His hands were gloved, but they moved with the surety of someone who belonged, who had waited a long time to arrive exactly here. Then came the sound. Not a voice, not quite. A kind of music, but twisted, like bells rung in reverse or hymns sung underwater. Milo said he could feel it vibrating in his bones, like the chapel itself was being unstitched. He remembered this clearly, the moment Alaric dropped to one knee, not in fear, but in recognition, and then the candles went out. When Milo blinked again, the room was empty. No prince, no figure, only a smear of ash on the altar, shaped like a handprint. He ran. They found him hours later, curled beneath a butcher's bench, muttering about shadows that didn't match the shapes that cast them. The council dismissed his account as the fevered dream of a frightened child. But one man did not. Brother Elian, a monk of the lower order, copied Milo's testimony by hand before the official record was sealed. In the margins, he wrote a curious note. What the boy describes matches the old tale of the night guest, the one who enters unbidden on the 8th bell, bearing no name, asking no questions, only silence in return. The night guest legend was old, obscure, believed only by those who listened to cradle stories whispered during storms. But it wasn't just folklore. In the archives of Greystone Abbey, long since dissolved, there exists a single illuminated manuscript showing a robed figure placing a hand upon a kneeling nobleman's brow. The next panel shows that same nobleman lying in a bed of thorns, with a crown of crows above his head. It's been catalogued simply as the Prince Who Woke the Dead. Back in the royal court, Milo was quietly reassigned, first to the stables, then to a far-off monastery on the sea cliffs of Braston Moor. His name never appeared again in royal ledgers, except once. 5 years later, during the reign of Queen Isolde's successor, a letter arrived from Braston bearing the abbey seal. It was addressed to the crown but never opened. The seal remains unbroken to this day, preserved in the Royal Archive vault. Written across the back, in small, cramped script, I saw the prince again. He stood at the edge of the sea. His eyes were closed, but I swear he was listening. No one has dared open that letter. Even now, scholars debate the reliability of Milo's account. Some say a child's imagination was fed by fear. Others believe his tale contains a kernel of truth buried in metaphor. A few, particularly those familiar with the deeper folk traditions of the realm, note that many deaths of powerful men throughout history share a pattern, an unexplained light, a sudden chill, a final breath spoken to no one in particular. They wonder, quietly, whether Milo saw something ancient that night, something meant to stay hidden, and if so, what it means that it appeared before a prince. The Queen's smile was a lie. In the weeks following the prince's death, Queen Isolde grieved exactly as a queen was expected to grieve. She wore her mourning silks. She walked slowly, hands folded, lips pale, hair unadorned. She did not speak more than was necessary. At the funeral she did not weep, but her stillness was interpreted by the court as strength, not silence. "A mother of iron," one duchess remarked. "She mourns in the way a lioness guards her last cub." But the servants noticed something else. Behind closed doors, when no courtier watched, the queen would sometimes smile. Not the smile of sorrow touched by fond memory, not the hollow, aching smile of someone reliving a lost childhood. This was something colder, fainter, a smile that flickered at the corners of her mouth and vanished before it could be called emotion. And each time it appeared, her gaze would drift, not toward the prince's empty chambers, but to the high tower, where the royal astrologer kept his midnight watch. This astrologer, Magister Vale, had served under 3 monarchs. He was older than the queen, older than the war, older than the stones of the castle, or so he claimed. He rarely left his observatory, save for his weekly visit to the queen's private solar. No one knew what was discussed during these visits. But the day before Alaric died, Vale had stayed longer than usual, much longer. Long enough that the guards remarked on it, and when he emerged, he was smiling too. There was something theatrical in how quickly the narrative of grief was woven. By the 2nd day, the scribes had released commemorative verses. By the 3rd, coins were minted bearing the boy prince's profile. By the 7th, a new heir was named, one of Isolde's cousins, conveniently elevated to first in line, despite a tangle of disputed blood claims. It was as if the court had rehearsed this death, and yet, whisper, ours persisted. Some said the queen had gone mad with sorrow, that she wandered the castle at night, whispering her son's name, that she left meat out on windowsills for his return. Others said she never wandered at all, but remained perfectly still, seated before the chapel's sealed doors, listening for something no one else could hear. One page claimed he had passed her chamber after midnight and heard her speaking in a tongue he couldn't understand. A servant's daughter, dismissed after a broken dish, swore that she had seen the queen's shadow move before her body did, stretching long and serpentine across the marble floor, as if it no longer belonged to her. Of course, none of this was proven. Gossip clings to queens like ivy to stone. But the letters tell a subtler story. Among the correspondence recovered from the hidden archives, 3 stand out. The first, dated just 3 days after the prince's death, is addressed to the Grand Bishop of the Eastern Marches. It reads, "There is a change in the stars. Magister Vale says the constellation of the Seeker now bends away from its proper course. He believes this is not symbolic but literal. I request the bishop's mirror from the cathedral's vault. It must be shipped at once. Tell no one." The bishop's mirror was a relic, part divining tool, part astronomical map, said to reflect not only the heavens, but the soul's orientation within them. For centuries it had been locked away, deemed too unstable for regular use. That the Queen would summon it now, in secret, suggests she believed something far more than grief had descended on the kingdom. The second letter, this one unsigned but bearing her personal cipher, was addressed to someone simply called E. It is short. He was not taken, he was received. The guest left a mark. Vale believes it can be read, but not by daylight. And finally, the third letter, found in a private volume of botanical diagrams. The thing I feared most was not losing him. It was the bargain I made when he was born. He was never mine. Not fully. I thought I could cheat the ending, but now it begins again. There is no context for this last message, but the implications are chilling. Could it be that Queen Isolde, so composed, so dignified, had struck some hidden accord for her son's birth, a pact with something outside the realm of common understanding? If so, who or what was the guest she referred to, and was Prince Alaric's death the price of breaking that pact? Scholars have debated the phrasing for years. Some believe the term received implies that Alaric had been chosen, not murdered, that his departure was orchestrated not by poison or knife, but by invocation. Others point to the phrase, "it begins again," as evidence of a cycle, an ancient ritual that repeats across generations, involving royalty, succession, and something that lives between shadows. Whatever the truth, Queen Isolde never spoke publicly of her son again. Her later years were marked by serenity, a quiet dignity, a slow fading into myth. She died in her sleep, or so the records claim, though the mortician's report was curiously missing from the royal archive. At her funeral, the high tower bell rang 13 times. It had only ever been built to ring 12. The final toll echoed for nearly a full minute, low, long, and without wind, and those who heard it remembered the Queen's strange flickering smile, the one that never quite reached her eyes. The mirror that reflected too much. The bishop's mirror arrived at the palace in the dead of night, under heavy guard, cloaked in layers of silk and secrecy. Not a soul was informed outside the Queen's most trusted inner circle, just 4 individuals, Magister Vale, the royal physician, the captain of the Queen's Guard, and a girl of 17 known only as Amara, the Queen's quiet hand. She was neither lady-in-waiting nor servant, neither spy nor scribe, yet she held keys to rooms no other soul could enter. Her origins were a mystery, but it was said Isolde had brought her from the north during one of her last diplomatic visits before the war, where the sun never quite set, and children were born with second sight. The mirror was not truly a mirror, at least not in the usual sense. It had no glass. Its surface shimmered like polished obsidian, deeper than night. When first uncovered in the Queen's private solar, it was said that the air itself recoiled. Candles refused to burn near it. Even seasoned guards turned their eyes away, as if it might gaze back. Only Vale stood before it without fear. He spoke a word no one recorded, an archaic tongue not used in centuries, and the mirror bloomed. A pale light spread across its surface, and for one breathless moment, they all saw it. The reflection, not of themselves, but of something older, a vast plain beneath storm-coloured skies, a spire in the distance, spiralling not upward but downward, as if into the earth's own memory, and shapes, tall, too thin, faces hidden, moving along the ridges of the horizon. Amara was the first to scream. She collapsed, clutching her head, whispering in some forgotten language. The royal physician tried to approach but staggered backward, nose bleeding, muttering the Lord's Prayer in reverse. The captain, stoic, battle-hardened, fell to his knees and wept without knowing why. Only the Queen and Vale remained upright. What they saw, only they could say. But after the mirror was returned to its case and sealed once again in silk and shadow, Queen Isolde's eyes did not blink for a full 5 minutes, and when she finally spoke, it was to whisper, "He wasn't taken from us, he was retrieved." The next morning, the Queen gave new orders. The mirror was not to be sent back to the cathedral. It was instead lowered into the palace crypts, deeper than any relic had ever gone. Only Vale and Amara accompanied the descent. When they returned, Amara's hair had turned white. She never spoke again, except in sleep, and only in a voice that was not hers. For the next several weeks, the Queen withdrew from court entirely. The ministers ruled in her name. Laws passed without her signature. Visitors were turned away. It was assumed that grief had overtaken her at last, that the brave mask she'd worn for the sake of appearances had finally crumbled beneath the weight of sorrow. The city whispered of a queen driven mad by loss. But inside the high tower, something else was happening. Vale began recording his observations daily. The stars, he claimed, were shifting, not metaphorically, literally. The constellations themselves had changed course. One by one, ancient patterns began bending. The hunter's belt stretched farther east, the watcher dimmed, and the seeker, the one associated with birth, youth, and rightful heirs, vanished entirely. It was as if the sky had been rewritten. When the court astronomer, a skeptic named Lorien, was invited to confirm these changes, he reportedly refused to even look through the lens. "That is not a sky I know," he muttered, "and not one I wish to meet." Shortly thereafter, he resigned and fled the kingdom. Others who attempted to chart the sky soon reported similar unease. The maps wouldn't hold, ink would fade, paper warped, and the stars themselves seemed wrong, as if each was not merely distant, but watching, remembering. One scribe wrote, "I looked up and saw not stars but openings, tiny, patient mouths." Of course, all such entries were burned. Officially, there was nothing wrong. The realm was stable, trade flowed, nobles bickered over land and titles as they always had, but those closest to the crown knew something deeper had shifted. A crack had formed, thin, invisible to most, but a crack all the same, and through it, something ancient was beginning to seep. It wasn't until Amara disappeared that panic truly set in. She was last seen walking toward the crypts, alone, barefoot. Guards were posted, the gates locked, yet somehow she entered, and never returned. In her chambers, a note was left behind. He calls from beneath the veil, not as he was, but as he will become. What followed was a wave of quiet purges. Servants dismissed without cause, letters burned, rooms sealed. Queen Isolde ordered the chapel's stained glass windows removed and replaced with solid stone. The bell tower was never rung again, and on the palace walls symbols began to appear, subtle carvings just beneath the cornices, protective glyphs, runes of warding, written not in Latin or Greek, but in something much older and long since forbidden. To the world, the queen had gone silent in mourning, but behind stone and shadow she was preparing, not for more grief, but for return. The return of the prince who wasn't. It began with a scent, not a stench, nor perfume, something faintly metallic like rain on cold stone. The guards stationed outside the Queen's solar reported it first. They swore the wind turned, though no windows were open. Tapestries fluttered without cause. Then came the hush. Birds stopped singing. Dogs refused to enter the tower. Even the fire in the hearth sputtered low, as if bowing in submission to something ancient, something long absent. That night, the Queen emerged for the first time in over a fortnight. She descended the spiral stair barefoot, her hair unbraided, her eyes wide with something neither madness nor clarity, but the flickering edge between. At her side was Vale, gaunter than ever, clutching a bundle wrapped in black cloth. He held it not as one would a relic, but as one might carry something that whispered when touched. They said she walked to the throne room without a word, that the guards stepped aside, though she gave no command, that her steps echoed like hammers on bone. And there, before her full court, she announced what no one dared imagine. "My son has returned." Gasps filled the hall. Someone dropped a goblet. The Chancellor nearly collapsed. At the back of the room stood the prince, or what claimed to be him. He was taller than before, though still no older in face. His eyes were darker, deeper, as though they had stared through something far beyond death. He He did not smile. He barely blinked. But when the Queen crossed the floor and took his hand in hers, the room stood still. She whispered his name. He gave no reply. Yet no one could speak against it. Who would? Who could? The Queen had declared it so. That night, the bells were rung again, for the first time since his disappearance. Throughout the city, candles were lit in celebration. Children sang, nobles wept, messengers were dispatched to every neighbouring realm with the news, the prince lives. And yet, not all were convinced. The cook, a mother of 5 who had once spoon-fed the boy soup during his fevered childhood, swore it was not him. His eyes, she whispered, used to crinkle when he smiled. These eyes do not crinkle. She vanished a day later. The prince's old dog, a wolfhound named Elar, refused to go near him. When brought to the throne room, the hound let out a long, mournful howl, then threw itself from the palace terrace. No one retrieved the body, and the Queen herself changed in subtle, accumulating ways. She ceased attending Mass. The chapel remained locked. Her speech slowed, as though translated from a different tongue before it left her lips. She took to wearing a single colour, ashen grey, and dismissed half her council in one morning, replacing them with hooded advisers whose names no one ever heard. More than once, it was said, she stood at the palace walls at dawn, whispering to the horizon. But the most disturbing detail came from a stable boy named Erwin. He had been tasked with taking food to the prince's quarters, and being young, foolish and curious, he peeked through the door. Inside, he claimed, the prince sat before no fire, just the mirror, uncovered. The room was freezing, frost gathering on the windows despite midsummer heat. The prince leaned toward the obsidian surface, murmuring in a language Erwin did not know. The mirror rippled. And then the boy saw something impossible. The reflection in the mirror was not the prince. It was a vast face, neither male nor female, too large to belong in the space behind it. Its eyes were shut, but then they opened, and Erwin ran. By morning, he had gouged out his own eyes with a shard of broken slate, muttering, "Not the prince, not the prince, not the—" He died that evening. His tongue had turned black. Still, the Queen held firm. The court was ordered to treat the prince as heir. His chambers were refurnished. Lessons resumed. A betrothal was arranged to the daughter of a northern duke. Foreign emissaries brought gifts. No one questioned. No one dared. But in back rooms, behind closed doors, whispers spread like rot. That he didn't eat. That his shadow sometimes pointed the wrong way. That one of the scribes tasked with drafting his daily letters claimed they were blank until dusk, and then, without ink, writing would appear. Letters in a language of curves and thorns. One monk, who attempted to decipher them, bled from his ears and dropped dead within the hour. But the prince laughed. He laughed rarely, only once, in fact. It was during a feast. A nobleman, a jester of sorts, told a joke about a bear who dressed like a bishop. The court chuckled politely. Then the prince laughed, too long, too loud, and too high, like a child who'd just learned how sound worked. The hall fell silent, and then the chandelier shook. It was subtle, but every candle went out at once, and from beneath the floor something knocked. From that night onward, the Queen slept with her door sealed in iron. Only Vale was permitted to see her. The rest of the court began to suffer strange dreams, visions of deep waters, spinning stars, voices without mouths. One knight drew his sword on his own reflection. Another threw himself into the palace well. A third, in full armour, marched out of the city at dawn and was never seen again. The Queen offered no explanations, but the glyphs on the walls multiplied. When a new priest was assigned to the chapel and attempted to re-sanctify the grounds, he burst into flames upon stepping over the threshold. Still, the Queen ruled. Still, the prince smiled, and no one, Not even those who remembered the real boy dared say aloud what they feared most, that whoever this was, whatever had come in his place, it had not returned, it had arrived. The blood banquet, the banquet that followed his return, would become legend. Not for its splendour, though it was lavish beyond reason, not for its guests, though every duke, baron, and foreign dignitary within riding distance of the capital had gathered, eager to confirm what they'd been told was true. No, it would become legend for what it revealed, not about the prince, but about the queen. The hall was lit with 1,000 candles. Gold-leafed banners of the royal house fluttered from rafters. Harps, dulcimers, and shawms filled the air with gentle melody. On silver platters lay roast swan, figs soaked in wine, whole sturgeon glistening with pearls of brine, honey-glazed doves, candied violets. Even the peasants outside the walls were given bread and small coins, tokens of celebration. At the head of the table the queen sat, her back perfectly straight, her face unreadable. She was dressed in dark crimson silk, her crown set lower than usual, almost covering her brow. Her left hand did not move the entire evening. At her side was the prince. He was dressed in pale gold. His hair had grown longer, but it was combed precisely as it had been before he vanished. He did not speak, he did not eat, he merely watched. Those who made eye contact with him described a sensation not unlike falling. And yet, to deny him was treason. To speak of what you saw in his gaze was madness. So the nobles drank deeply, toast after toast. To the prince, they bellowed, and to the queen's unbroken will, and to a kingdom restored. But with each toast, the queen grew stiller. And then came the moment no one could later explain. At the height of the meal, just as dessert was being served, almond tarts shaped like roses and spun with sugar glass, a servant tripped. He'd been carrying a silver jug of mulled wine. It struck the floor, and the wine spilled across the white linen like blood. The hall fell silent. The servant, young, trembling, dropped to his knees and begged forgiveness. Then slowly the prince turned. He looked at the boy, just looked, and the boy began to scream. He screamed as though flayed, though no one touched him. His skin reddened, then cracked, then peeled. Within moments he collapsed in a steaming heap beside the jug. His last breath was a gurgle. The queen did not blink. The prince smiled. And the guests, they did nothing. Not one person left. Not one demanded explanation. The feast resumed, the music continued, and the servants carried the body away on a tray draped in velvet, as if it were simply another course gone cold. After the meal, the guests were led to the ballroom. That's when the real horror began. At the far end of the ballroom was a new addition, a black statue, 7 feet tall, carved from obsidian. It had not been there before the prince's return. Its surface was too smooth for chisels, too cold for touch. It resembled neither man nor beast, but something in between. No one could meet its eyes, if they were eyes. The queen approached it first. She bowed, and then each guest was called forward by name, one by one. They approached the statue, they touched it with their palms, and they whispered something that made even the boldest among them tremble, something they would never speak aloud again. Whatever it was required. Not all completed the rite. A countess fainted mid-whisper. Her skin turned to salt. She crumbled before the court. A bishop refused outright. He drew his cross, shouting scripture. The queen raised a single finger. He exploded. Not figuratively, not in metaphor. His body ruptured, his organs liquefied, his robes fluttered empty to the marble floor. A page vomited on the spot. No one cleaned it. After that, none refused. They whispered, they bowed. They passed beneath the statue's shadow and emerged, pale, altered. Something in them shifted. Their eyes took longer to blink. their voices dropped in pitch. Later, in the records of foreign scribes and ambassadors who attended that night, identical phrases would appear, though no one could explain how they'd all come to the same image. The Queen's court became a forest of statues, living, breathing, and hollow inside. That banquet marked the last time the Queen ever appeared in public daylight. Her days were conducted behind shuttered windows. Her decrees were delivered by veil or the hooded ones. And the prince? He too disappeared from common sight, appearing only in dreams, in whispers, in the long corridors between candles. He walked the halls at hours when no footsteps should be heard. The guards stopped guarding his door. They stood outside facing outward, backs to him, as if to shield themselves from his gaze. Several were found wandering the garden labyrinth days later, eyes white as ash, speaking in spirals. The kingdom's festivals were cancelled, choirs replaced with bells. The bell tower rang 13 times at midnight now. The city's heart had changed. The statue remained in the ballroom, covered in crimson cloth. No one touched it. No one dared. But on the eve of the following winter solstice, the cloth was found on the floor, the statue gone. In its place, a hole in the marble, deep, smooth, endless. And beside it, a message scratched into the stone, not in Latin, not in the royal tongue, but in glyphs that seemed to move if stared at too long. Those who studied it went blind. Those who ignore, it, dreamed of falling endlessly with a voice at the bottom waiting to speak their name. Yet still the Queen ruled. Still the prince stood by her side, and the rest of the world, watching from beyond the borders, began to whisper something unthinkable, that the old Queen had won her war against the void, but had offered the kingdom as the price, the disappearance of the truth. By spring, the court had become a place of echoes, not from sound, but from memory. Echoes of people who had once spoken freely, laughed aloud, argued in council, or gossiped beneath stone arches. Now their voices were replaced by stillness. The courtiers still walked the halls, but they did so carefully, as if the stones beneath their feet might remember who they were and punish them for it. Everything that had once felt human in the royal palace had dimmed, and yet the kingdom continued. On paper, it even flourished. Trade routes opened with distant kingdoms that no ambassador remembered writing to. Gold flooded the coffers, new coins, bearing the Queen's face on one side and the prince's on the other. The reverse bore no inscription, only a ring of stars with no centre. Some said it resembled an eye. Still, taxes were collected, laws were passed, crops grew with unnatural abundance, disease fell away, but so did birth rates. In village after village, midwives reported the same thing: fewer children, longer labours, and more stillborns than any generation had ever known. The churches rang bells for dead infants more often than for elders. When the bishoprics requested audiences with the Queen to discuss it, they received identical responses every time. All things must be balanced. Priests began to disappear. Monks who had spent years transcribing holy texts were found sleeping with ink-black mouths, whispering verses no one had taught them. Even the grand cathedral in the capital began to tremble. Its stones creaked at dawn, and the stained glass windows sweated in the night. One morning, the tower was simply gone. In its place stood a black spiral of stone, smooth and featureless. Those who looked upon it for too long forgot what it replaced. Still, the Queen's court acted as if all was well. She issued proclamations praising the king, Om's renewal, thanking the prince for his guidance beyond the veil, and even offering public commendations to those who had embraced the turning. No one knew what that meant, but it was printed on banners across the realm. Behind closed doors, however, some still resisted. In the western provinces, several noble houses, long loyal to the throne, began holding secret councils. They whispered the unthinkable, that the prince was not truly the queen's son, that the boy who had vanished in the mountains had never come back, or worse, he had returned but no longer alone. They pointed to the changes, to the way his reflection never appeared in water, to how animals refused to go near him, to how every room he entered felt colder, quieter, thinner. They spoke of the queen's eyes, how they no longer blinked, how she no longer aged, how every day at court was the same as the one before. Some said they had watched a candle burn for 10 nights straight in her chambers, without ever growing shorter, and so a plan began to form. A new rebellion, not to depose her, but to uncover her, to reveal what she had become. A conclave was assembled in the ruins of a monastery west of the capital. Nobles, clerics, scholars, and 3 surviving knights of the original royal guard attended. Their goal was simple: find the truth. They brought with them artifacts, paintings, documents, childhood portraits of the prince, everything they could gather to compare, to confirm, to prove what their eyes feared to admit. What they discovered was worse than they'd imagined. The paintings were changed, not by forgers, but from within. Oils that had once shown a smiling child with a hawk now bled into darker hues, his face blurred, his eyes blank. One portrait, when exposed to firelight, revealed a second figure behind him, tall, thin, eyeless. Scrolls cracked open and revealed new passages that hadn't been there before, lines written in a language no one remembered learning, but everyone understood instinctively. A mirror used in the prince's nursery was brought forward. It was meant to prove he had been human once, but when held up, it reflected nothing. Not the room, not the viewer, only the sound of breathing, close, cold, and not the viewer's own. The final straw came when one of the knights, Sir Garin of Winthal, stood to recount a memory. He had guarded the queen since her youth. He remembered her laughter, her anger, her joy. He had once carried her across a river when the bridge broke in spring. He had sworn an oath to protect her with his life. But now, standing before that gathering, his voice faltered. He tried to describe her face. He couldn't. Not her eyes, not her hair, not even her height. Every detail slipped from his tongue as soon as he summoned it. "I can't remember what she looked like before he came back," he whispered. "I can't even remember what she sounded like." Then, suddenly, he drew his sword and drove it through his own chest. He died with a smile. Behind him, carved into the stone wall, where there had been nothing a moment before, appeared a spiral. Perfect. Black. Wet. The conclave fled. But it was too late. Within days, every attendee was dead. Some vanished, some were found burned in their own beds, with no fire damage around them. One man was found floating above his own estate, 30 feet in the air, unmoving. His blood rained down every hour on the howl. As if in rhythm, the kingdom's record keepers tried to erase mention of the conclave. Pages were torn, names were unlisted, but memory, as always, found a way to survive. And in the years that followed, strange phrases began appearing in the margins of books, carved into door frames, whispered by children in their sleep. She bore the weight of the void and called it love. He was her son, and yet not born of her. What returned was not what was lost. The spiral remembers. And so the Queen's mystery deepened. Not just the question of how the prince returned, but what had truly happened to her in the silence of that mountain pass. Had she made a pact? Had she summoned something to find him? Or had he summoned her? In the oldest records, those kept in sealed vaults below the founding chapel, an even older story was eventually found. It spoke of a queen from long ago who had ruled during a time of great famine. She had gone into the dark to seek aid from the gods, but the gods were silent, and something else had answered. What it offered was power, what it required was memory, and what it gave never truly left. The names that no one could say. The queen no longer addressed her people in person. Instead, a great tapestry was unveiled in the throne hall, not of scenes but of words, stitched in gold and obsidian thread, thousands of names that no one recognized, names not of nobles, not of saints, not of any line known in the kingdom's archives. They had no vowels, they twisted the tongue when spoken, some vanished from memory the moment they were read. The tapestry stretched 30 feet across the marble wall behind the throne. It shimmered without light, and yet each day one name would glow faintly. It was said that whoever that name belonged to disappeared by nightfall. They weren't executed, no blood was found, no doors broken, no signs of struggle. They simply stopped existing, in every record, every portrait, every memory. Children forgot their mothers, husbands their wives. Entire villages would wake up unsure why one bed was empty, but not even notice the absence. Only those who had begun to doubt the queen seemed capable of remembering at first, and then they too forgot. It was a terror made of silence, not war, a forgetting more final than death. The resistance, what little remained of it, began to call the tapestry the undying list. For while the queen never spoke its purpose, all understood it. It was her scripture. Her new court scribes, blind, draped in ash-coloured robes, maintained it. They did not write with ink, but with fine cuts from bone needles, threading darkness into the weave. Some said the names weren't being added, but uncovered, unearthed from threads that had always been there. And so the days turned. The palace gates never closed, but no one entered any more. Processions of hollow-eyed nobles came and went. Dancers performed before the throne to no music. Musicians played instruments that emitted no sound. Worse still, the queen smiled. Not often, enough. Enough to remind those who remembered the old days that she had once smiled for love or for laughter. Now it was only when the tapestry glowed. It was around this time that something strange began to appear across the kingdom's countryside. Black wells. Dozens of them, perfectly circular, dug where no villages had ever been. No tools marked the edges, no ropes hung from their lips, just smooth stone rims and fathomless dark below. No echo returned from their depths, no stones made sound when dropped. They bled mist in the mornings. One shepherd claimed he had seen his daughter step into one, chasing her reflection. He said she had not screamed, had not fallen. She had simply dissolved, like ink in water. In the capital, children began to hum lullabies no one had taught them. Always the same melody, always the same 3 notes. Mothers who tried to stop them would find themselves humming it days later, forgetting why it unsettled them. When a royal historian, one of the last who dared write, traced the lullaby's rhythm to an ancient language known only through fragmented rock inscriptions in the mountain crypts, he was brought before the queen. He was never seen again. But weeks later, in the marketplace, a child was heard reciting something new, a name. It wasn't hers, nor her family's, nor anyone's. It was the queen's. Not the name she wore now, but the one from before the throne, the one only her brother had ever used. No one should have known it, and yet there it was, spoken by a 6-year-old girl with no lineage, no connection, no history. She died the next night in her sleep. But not before her father said she whispered one final thing. She remembers who she was, but she doesn't want to be her anymore. That phrase sent shockwaves through the underground scholars still hidden in the northern monastery vaults. They had long believed the queen was fully and assumed that nothing of the woman she had been remained. But this meant something survived, a soul, or perhaps a memory. Some began to speculate. What if she was not willingly possessed? What if she was a vessel, an unwilling host to something far older, far colder than any spirit or curse? And what if the names on the tapestry were not victims, but replacements, trial runs, names tried on like cloaks, each a soul she wore for a night, then shed when it didn't fit. One of the scholars, aged, trembling, barely able to hold a quill, wrote a final note before he too disappeared. She is no longer a queen, she is a library. A god is building itself from memory, and we are its stories. In that final winter before the great eclipse, 3 things happened in rapid succession. First, the stars vanished. Not all at once, but one by one. The astrologers, what few were left, tracked them desperately, weeping as they faded. One night, a nobleman threw himself from the observatory tower, screaming that he'd seen a new star appear, but it was watching us. Second, the Queen declared that spring would never come again. No decree was written, but across the land trees refused to bud, birds stopped migrating, time itself seemed stuck in a pale grey dusk. And finally, the prince returned to the mountains. He left at dusk, alone, walking barefoot across the snow. No guards, no fanfare, no warning. The Queen did not try to stop him. Some say she wept. Others say she whispered a word that no one had heard before, and the word turned to dust in the air. Whatever the truth, the prince vanished into the same pass where he'd disappeared years ago, but this time he did not return alone. 2 weeks later, black riders were seen descending from the mountain, tall, faceless, robed not in cloth, but in pages, thousands of them, torn from books no one had written yet. They said nothing, but every mirror cracked the moment they passed. Every newborn stopped crying, as if listening, and behind them, in the pass, the spiral appeared once more, not carved into stone, but into the sky. The spiral in the sky. It was vast, at first mistaken for a storm front, then a flock of birds, but neither thunder nor wing made it shift. The spiral held its shape through night and day, visible even at noon when the sun tried to blind it from the eyes below. It wasn't natural, it moved against the clouds, it swallowed stars, and it was not still. Each day it turned slightly, clockwise at dawn, counterclockwise by dusk. Observers said it pulsed as though breathing, as though alive, or watching. The Queen stood beneath it in her tower, alone. Some claimed she no longer walked the halls of her palace, that she was rooted there, unmoving, like a tree grown from marble. Others believed she had already died, and what remained was a shape in her likeness, hollowed and reanimated by whatever had emerged from the mountains. But no one dared climb the tower to see for certain. The last man who tried burned without flame halfway up the stairs. By now, the prince was gone again. He had walked with the black riders into the high valleys. They left no footprints. They passed through villages like wind, shattering every clock, inverting weathercocks, wilting every flower that dared bloom. The spiral grew larger each day. In one town, a monk painted it obsessively across his monastery wall, even as his hands blistered and bled. When asked why, he whispered, "So I will not forget the shape of the god before it becomes me." The Queen did not summon him. She didn't need to. That night, the monastery roof collapsed inward in perfect silence. The monk's body was never recovered, only his heart, petrified and hollowed like wood. And still, the tapestry glowed. Its golden threads dimmed now, the obsidian more vibrant than ever. Some of the names began to repeat, not perfectly, but like echoes, variants, slight distortions. Marilyn became Mariel, Jocelyn became Jostlin, always just wrong enough to feel uncanny. And in the villages, children began to answer to them, even if those weren't their names, even if they hadn't heard them spoken before. Some said the Queen wasn't choosing names anymore, she was planting them, seeding herself outward. And the spiral, above, vast, wheeling, was the bloom. Somewhere in the northern mountains, a group of women who had escaped the royal court gathered in an abandoned observatory, trying to chart the spiral's movements. They weren't astronomers, They were former servants, midwives, and scullery maids who remembered the Queen before the fall. They weren't trying to understand the spiral, they were trying to trap it. Their plan was madness, to cast it into ink, to write its shape over and over until it was locked in place, frozen on parchment, to bind it like one might a story, unfinished but closed. But as they wrote, one by one, their hands began to tremble. The spiral didn't want to be drawn, it drew back. In a final act of desperation, one of them, a girl named Lysa, no more than 17, cut her palm and traced the spiral in her own blood, not in ink, not in oil, but in life. She finished the final curve, screamed a word no one had taught her, and vanished, just gone. No burst of light, no scream, no wind, just silence. And then the observatory exploded inward, books turning to dust, glass turning to water, stone turning to breath. When it cleared, only the spiral remained, burned into the floorboards, still wet. And in the capital the Queen blinked, for the first time in years, and she spoke aloud, just once. She said a single word. Brother. No one heard it but the walls, but they remembered, they cracked. A fault line split the throne room, dividing the Queen from the tapestry. For a moment the glow halted, the names froze, and the Queen stepped forward. For the first time in months, or perhaps years, she oved. Her feet touched ground, her eyes did not glow. She looked around the empty court and spoke again. Where is he? No answer. She turned to the tapestry, trembling, but the tapestry turned to her. The names began to spin, literally spin, as if embroidered threads could whirl like dials. Faster and faster they rotated, until the centre unravelled, and a single black word emerged. You. The Queen stepped back, and in that moment, one terrible second, the world remembered everything it had forgotten. Thousands of names, faces, days, years, rushed back like a flood. Sons remembered mothers, priests remembered heresies, shepherds remembered their lost sheep. The sky darkened, the spiral screamed, not sound, but light, a flare that poured across the sky like molten gold, forming symbols no one could read, but everyone understood. It was a command, and in the mountains the prince awoke. He had been asleep for days, perhaps longer, beneath a glacier that had not existed before. The black riders stood above him, silent, but now they moved, all of them, toward the capital. As the Queen fell to her knees and whispered, "It's not me anymore," the black riders return. The hooves did not echo. When the black riders came down from the mountains, they passed like night falling, slow, steady, inescapable. No one spoke their names, no one knew their names, but each of them carried something ancient beneath their cloaks, not weapons, not relics, something far worse. Memory. They were not soldiers, they were not messengers, they were returns. Each one bore a resemblance to someone who had once lived in the kingdom, long dead, long buried, a sister lost to fever, a lover drowned in the river, a king who had vanished in the snow. But none of them smiled, none of them spoke, and none of them blinked. The prince rode among them now, though his crown was gone. His hair had turned white as chalk, and behind his eyes sat a knowledge that had not been his when he left. Something had filled him. The Queen, alone in her throne room, saw them from her tower before any scout could send word. She did not weep, she did not flee, she waited. Because she knew this moment had already happened once before. It had been a mistake to try to change it. That's what the spiral had shown her, not the future, but the past repeating. History, not in a line, but in a spiral, coiling back upon itself, each loop tighter, each turn darker. She was at the centre, and so was he. When the black riders entered the city gates, no one stopped them, Guards dropped their swords, priests dropped to their knees, mothers clutched their children and whispered forgotten lullabies. One of the riders peeled away from the procession. He entered the old square, where the first tapestry had once been hung in celebration. The square was empty now, abandoned for years after the riots, but this rider stood there, silent, until the others reached the palace. Then he opened his hand, and from his palm fell a thread, just one. It glowed with impossible colour, shifting from silver to violet to deepest red. When it touched the stone, the square bloomed, not with flowers, with words. They sprouted like vines across the walls, down the statues, through the cracks in the pavement, not in any living language, not in any dead one either, but every person who saw them understood. This is what was taken. This is who you were before she chose. The Queen saw the writing too. She turned from her window. She crossed the room. She stepped to the tapestry, and for the first time in her reign, she pulled it down. It did not resist her. It came away easily, almost lightly, as if it had never been heavy at all. Beneath it, behind the false wall, was a door. No one had ever noticed it, not even the builders. She opened it. Behind the door, a staircase spiraled downward, carved from obsidian lined with mirrors. At every landing, a name, her name, but changed, each a variation, like the echoes in the tapestry. Elian, Aelira, Nice, the Queen without time. At the bottom, a room. No windows, no doors, no light, but there was a throne, and on it a woman who looked exactly like her, except older, weary and smiling. "Finally," the woman said, "you remembered." The Queen stepped forward, heart thudding. "What is this?" The woman on the throne raised her hand, and in it she held a thread. The same kind the rider had dropped. "I am what comes after the last mistake," the older woman said, "the one who must remember everything, and undo it." The Queen trembled. Undo what? The choosing. The room shifted. For a moment they stood not underground, but in the throne room above. The day she had taken the crown, the day she had whispered the first name, the day she'd made her first change. She saw it all play again, the mother, the boy, the name that wasn't his, and how it had bent the world. The spiral wasn't just memory, it was guilt. It was consequence given shape. The older woman rose. "This is the last time you'll see me," she said, "because it's the last time you'll be allowed to choose." Then she handed the thread to the Queen and vanished. The Queen was alone again. She returned to the throne room. The black riders were there, waiting in a silent circle. The prince stood at the centre. He looked at her, not with anger, not with pity, but with recognition. "You have the thread," he said. "Yes," he nodded. "Then you know what you must do." The Queen walked past him, past the tapestry, past the guards, out into the old square where the words still bloomed. She climbed the statue at the centre, once of a forgotten hero, and stood before the gathered city. Then she held the thread aloft. "This is what I took," she said, "and this is how I return it." And with one motion she tore the thread in two. The sky cracked open. The spiral vanished. The names on the tapestry burned away, and for the first time in generations, silence settled over the kingdom, but not empty silence, peaceful, free. The Queen collapsed in the square, her body cradled by stone, not dead, just still, as if her story had ended and she was no longer needed in the telling. The black riders turned, and one by one they became smoke. The prince remained. He looked at the people, and he said, "We begin again." The prince without a kingdom. No crown rested on his brow, but the prince walked with the quiet certainty of someone who had once carried one and no longer needed it. The people didn't bow to him. They didn't cheer, either. They simply watched, in that long hush after revelation, as if afraid even their breath might disrupt what had just been broken open. The Queen lay beneath the statue, eyes closed, not asleep, not lifeless, but suspended. as though she had stepped away from time itself, leaving only a silhouette behind. Some whispered that her final act had made her holy. Others said she had undone herself entirely, become unnameable once more. The prince knelt beside her. He didn't speak. He didn't weep. Instead, he reached out and gently touched her hand, then rose and walked away, into the city, into the people. He had no throne, no retinue, just the same cloak he'd worn when he rode with the Black Riders, and in his pocket, though none saw it, he carried something else, a single thread. It had not been torn. It had fallen from the Queen's hand unnoticed, a remnant from before. He didn't look at it, not yet. Instead, he moved through the city like a ghost in reverse, becoming more visible with each step. People began to follow him, not out of command, not out of loyalty, just curiosity. A butcher's son, a blind weaver, a girl who once dreamed of being a mapmaker. They followed him not to a throne, but to the river that had once carried bodies, that had once whispered names. Now it whispered nothing. The prince knelt and placed the thread into the water. For a moment it floated, gleaming, turning slowly like a dying star. Then it sank. The river didn't change colour, it didn't boil, but it did shiver, just once, and the people felt it. Something old had ended, and something new refused to begin too quickly. The prince stood. "I am not your king," he said. "And I won't become one." No one objected. They just waited. He looked at the weaver, at the butcher's son, at the girl with her unlived maps. Then he said, "What we make now, we make together." And he walked west, toward the fields, not to rule, to begin. They say the prince built nothing of marble, no towers, no palaces. Instead, he planted. One tree for each name he remembered. He did not speak them aloud. He buried them like seeds. And in the years that followed, a forest grew, not thick, not wild, but orderly, as if memory itself had taken root. Each tree bloomed in its own time. Some bore fruit, others sang. Yes, sang. Low notes at dusk, high at dawn, the air full of tones that matched no known instrument. People came not to live in that forest, but to listen. It became known as the Grove of Names. No paths were cut, no signs were posted. Those who entered left behind something of themselves, a lie, a memory, a question, and if they waited, they often found something new in return. Not always what they wanted, but what they needed. The prince remained there for years, not a hermit, not a guide, just there. When asked what had happened, what had really happened, he never gave a straight answer. He would smile, shake his head, and say only, "She stopped the spiral." Then, after a pause, "So we must be careful not to start a new one." Sometimes he would sit by the river and hold his hand just above the water, and sometimes the water would answer, not with words, but with warmth. He grew old. He did not vanish as the Queen had. He died as any man might, quietly, beneath the tree that bore the name of the boy he once had been. He was buried beneath it. No marker, no inscription. But the tree grew tall, its bark pale as bone, and its leaves dark as ink. And every autumn they would fall in perfect spirals, never touching, never repeating, as if time itself remembered how not to be a prison. The people changed, too, not overnight, not all at once, but stories stopped being written in stone. They were sung, painted, whispered. Names were no longer fixed, they were fluid, like rivers. And the tapestries? They were never hung again. Instead, people wove new things, blankets, sails, rope for bridges, cloth for cradles. Useful things, things that could be unmade and remade. The old palace was left untouched. Some say it still holds a room with no windows, a throne with no queen. Others say it faded the moment the thread was torn. But every so often, on still nights, someone sees a figure standing on the tower where the queen once looked out. Not ghost, not memory, just possibility. Watching, waiting. And beneath the tower, in the square where the spiral words once bloomed, children play. They draw spirals in chalk, but they never finish them. They always leave the last curve open. Because even now the lesson holds. A name can begin a story, but only silence can end one well. The throne. No one claimed. Long after the prince had passed, long after the threads had been scattered and the forest had grown quiet, the old palace still stood, not in majesty, but in shadow. Ivy climbed its flaking stone, birds nested in its broken windows, and the gates, once too grand to touch, swung crooked in the wind, like a jaw trying to remember how to speak. No one lived there, but no one tore it down either. They said it belonged to no one, that it never truly had, that the throne inside had become like a blade buried too deep, too dangerous to dig up, too sharp to forget. The children told stories about it. How if you crept inside at dusk, you could still hear the queen's footsteps echoing across the marble. How sometimes, if the moonlight struck just right, the throne looked as though someone sat in it, but only out of the corner of your eye, and how, if you whispered your name in the great hall, something whispered it back, but differently, slightly changed, older, wiser, stranger, and no one ever dared to sit in the throne, not because of fear, but because of awe, because somehow it felt as though the story hadn't truly ended, not there. It had simply unravelled far enough that no one could find the end anymore. One day a girl from the northern border, barefoot, hair tangled, eyes sharp as frost, walked through the city, past the forest, up to the palace steps. She said nothing, carried nothing. When the guards, what few still lingered, asked who she was, she answered simply, "I'm looking for the thread." They let her pass. What else could they do? She crossed the great hall, where the air still smelled faintly of candle smoke and dust, and stood before the throne. She did not sit. Instead, she reached behind it, where stone met stone, and pulled gently. A door opened. No one had ever seen it before. It wasn't hidden. It just hadn't wanted to be found. Behind, it was a staircase, spiralling of course, leading not up, but down. She descended without fear. Some say she vanished. Others say she returned a year later, her hair now white as the moon, eyes filled with something too vast to name. She never told what she'd found, but from that day on, the throne grew cold. Cold, not like winter, but like forgotten things. Like metal left untouched for centuries, it rusted at the edges, cracked in the seat. And finally, one spring, it broke in half, split cleanly, like something that had been waiting to give way. No one repaired it. Instead, they carried the pieces down to the river, melted them in the flame of 1,000 candles, and cast the metal into a bell. Not a war bell, not a warning bell, a bell that rang only once a year. At the edge of winter, when the sky was soft and bruised with memory, and when it rang, people paused, not to mourn, not to remember, but simply to be still, to listen. Because in that sound, deep and slow and echoing across the valleys, they could hear not a command, not a history, but a question, always the same, still unanswered, still echoing, still alive. What name will you give to what comes next? And in that silence, in that space, the bell opened between heartbeats and snowfall. The people understood. The throne had never been a seat of power. It had been a trap, a spiral turned inward, and breaking it had been the final act of love. The Queen's legacy was not in the palace, not in the forest, not even in the prince. It was in the refusal to name what should remain unknown, in the courage to end a pattern, and in the humility to leave some stories unfinished. For stories, like threads fray when pulled too tight, but left open gently they become something more. They become music. They become myth. They become the very silence that cradles all truth. And so the city lived on, not under a crown, not under a rule, but under a promise that no one would ever again be bound by the thread of a name they did not choose, and that every story would end, not with a period, not even with a spiral, but with a breath, a pause, and a path forward, still unwalked, still waiting, still wide open. The one witness who never spoke again. They say there's always someone who sees, someone who was close enough, quiet enough, unimportant enough that the world forgets they were even there until the truth demands a shape. In this case, that someone had a name, though no one remembered it. She was simply called the Linen Girl. She was born behind the kitchens, raised in the servants' yard, and slept under the eaves of the laundry hut beside the palace walls. She was the one who cleaned the royal sheets, rinsed blood from handkerchiefs no one ever asked about, and folded cloaks with hands that shook but never spilled a word. On the night the prince vanished, she had been on the stairs. Not the main ones, never those. Those were for feet that left echoes. She walked the back ones, the ones that twisted between walls like veins, meant for those who served. She hadn't meant to be near the tower, but laundry waits for no curfew, and the Queen's gown needed to be ready by morning. The guards didn't see her. They never did. She knew how to become part of the stone, how to keep her eyes on her feet, how to make herself small, and so she stood, hidden in a shadow barely wide enough for her breath, as voices rose behind a door not meant to be opened. She heard one voice, then two, then silence. A silence too sudden to be natural, then footsteps, then a sound, not a scream, not a cry, but a gasp, small, involuntary, like someone discovering the knife too late. She didn't move, didn't even breathe. When the door opened, she saw a figure step out. She knew his name, everyone did, but no one ever believed he had been there that night. Because his alibi was perfect. Because his boots were clean. Because the sword at his belt had never left its sheath, so he said, but she knew. Because as he passed, he turned, and for the briefest moment his eyes met hers, and he didn't speak, didn't Arten didn't even blink. He just smiled, a small, crooked thing, as if they shared a secret, as if her silence was already his. The Linen Girl never spoke of it, not because she was afraid, but because she understood something that no one else did. If she told them, they'd twist it. They'd take what she saw and shape it to fit the story they wanted, not the truth, so she buried it, like all the other stains. She kept her head down, folded sheets, boiled water, laughed quietly when the other girls whispered about the Queen's madness or the prince's ghost. But inside, deep in the part of her that had no name, she carried it. That smile, that step, that moment of absolute stillness before a story unravels. And then, one spring morning, she was gone. No one noticed, not right away, but when the Queen asked for her linens, no one could find the girl who washed them. Some said she had run, others said she had drowned, but the oldest maid in the kitchen said something stranger. She said the girl had been taken back by the stone, that the palace itself had claimed her, because she knew too much, because the walls were tired of carrying the weight of secrets alone. Years later, a boy exploring the cellars found a pair of shoes, tiny, worn, tucked between bricks behind an old barrel. Beside them was a cloth bundle. Inside, a folded royal tunic, stained, faded, still smelling faintly of lavender and something else, something older, something red. They burned the tunic, buried the shoes, and told no one. But the boy, now grown, remembered, and when he became archivist of the realm, he kept one thing, a scrap of the tunic, wrapped in silk, hidden inside a book no one ever read. The book was about justice, about truth, about how history is written by those who survive. But the linen girl, she had been the last witness, and by staying silent she did what none of the lords, scribes or bishops could. She preserved the truth, untainted, unused, waiting, like a key left beside a locked door no one dared open. The queen who walked through fire, the castle that once whispered with secrets, now echoed with something far worse, absence, the kind of emptiness that clung to corners, that made every step feel like a trespass. But the queen remained, not just in body, in will, in defiance, in her refusal to vanish like all the others. They had tried to erase her, quietly of course, not with blades or poison, but with something far more effective, forgetting. They rewrote her name in ledgers, moved her quarters to a colder wing, assigned younger maids who had never known her kindness, only the rumours. She was no longer invited to court ceremonies. Her seal was removed from letters. She became a guest in the house she had ruled, but she never left, because the fire still burned behind her eyes. It hadn't always been this way. She had once been a young bride from a northern kingdom, famed for her sharp mind and sharper tongue. She knew how to command a room without raising her voice, how to turn a council of bickering nobles into a silent audience. She had a son who looked just like her, and a husband who, despite his many flaws, had once looked at her as if she were the axis on which his world turned. That was before the rot set in. Before the court began to whisper that her son wasn't hers, that his lineage was impure, that he favoured her people too much, that he had her blood in his decisions. And then, the accident, the fall, the fever, the disappearance. They called it an illness at first, then a journey, then a treasonous flight. She never believed any of it, because she knew the sound of her child's voice in fear. She had heard it that night. He had cried out, just once, not loud, but enough. And when the guards told her nothing had happened, when they blocked the stairs and turned their faces, she knew. There was no madness in her grief, only clarity. That was what terrified them most. She didn't scream, she didn't demand, she watched. And one by one, the men who had stood beside the throne began to avoid her eyes, because they could not look at her and feel clean. She had taken to walking at night, not in mourning robes, but in the colours of her youth, a deep blue cloak, a silver clasp at her throat, a gown embroidered with stags and stars and things the court no longer remembered. She passed through hallways like a ghost that refused to vanish, and in her wake servants bowed lower, guards stood straighter, pages stopped whispering, because something about her presence told the truth more clearly than any scroll ever could. The queen still remembered, and she would not be silent. In the winter of the 3rd year after her son's disappearance, a fire broke out in the east wing. No one knew how it started. Some blamed a dropped lantern, others a servant's carelessness. But it spread fast, too fast. Flames ate through the tapestries like parchment. Smoke poured into the stairwells. Screams echoed through the stone. And through it all she walked, barefoot, her cloak trailing sparks behind her. She did not run. She did not cover her mouth. She walked straight into the heart of the fire, into the room where her son had last been seen. And when the flames died, when the ash cooled, when the dawn broke over blackened beams and shattered glass, she emerged, burned, shaking, alive, and in her hands, wrapped in scorched velvet, was a wooden box. No one had seen it before, not the maids, not the scribes, not even the chamberlain who had overseen the inventories. She never opened it in front of anyone. But that day, something changed. She was no longer merely grieving, she was waiting, with purpose, like someone holding a torch in a cave where monsters still breathed. They tried again to exile her. Petitions were drawn, clergy summoned, claims made about her health, her mind, her instability. But none could move her, because even the king, grown old, hunched by guilt and wine, knew that she carried something they feared more than rebellion, proof. And so the queen lived on, in silence, in fire, in the forgotten halls of a palace that had tried to bury the truth. And though her name faded from court songs and her portraits were moved to the gallery's shadows, she endured, because she knew, because someone had to, because truth, once seen, is not a thing that can be put back in the box, even if it burns everything around it. The silent library, beneath the stones, beneath the citadel's western wall, behind a rusted iron grate no longer marked on any map, lay a passageway the court had long forgotten, or pretended to. It was the oldest part of the castle, older than the royal chapel, older than the foundation stones of the king's tower. It had once been a scriptorium, back when the land was ruled not by kings but by abbots and iron-willed scribes who copied knowledge by candlelight, when silence was law and the truth was carved into vellum by monks who feared no sovereign. Now, centuries later, that passage opened once again, because someone had broken the seal. The queen had ordered it, though not with her voice. She had scribbled a note in her own hand and left it beneath a servant's tray. No wax seal, no royal flourish, just a name and a command. Open the door under the chapel floor. Do not tell the steward. Bring only the archivist. And so it was done. The young archivist, barely more than a boy, with ink-stained fingers and eyes too sharp for his own good, followed the queen down a spiral staircase that narrowed as it fell. Dust fell in sheets as they passed. Roots broke through the stone like veins beneath skin. No one had stepped here in generations. But the queen moved like someone returning home. She carried the small wooden box she had saved from the fire, wrapped again in velvet. The archivist said nothing. He didn't dare. At the base of the stairs, a heavy iron door waited. Its bolts were corroded, but the queen had brought a key, a strange thing of bone and brass, unlike any the castle locksmith had ever forged. She inserted it, turned it, and the door sighed open. Inside, the air smelled of wax and rot. The walls were lined with books, scrolls, tablets, even parchment nailed directly to stone. Time had yellowed them, but the ink had not faded, and as the candlelight flickered across the walls, the archivist realized what he was seeing. It was a record, a secret one, a catalogue of every royal birth, adoption, death, and disappearance dating back hundreds of years. A library of secrets that the monarchy had buried, and now the queen had come to add her own. She handed him the box. Inside it was a folded cloth, linen, frayed at the edges, stained with something dark and faded. Blood, dried and ancient. The archivist's hands trembled as he lifted it. Embedded in the folds was a single gold clasp, small but unmistakable. It was the one worn only by heirs apparent on the day of oath. The queen looked at the boy and spoke, not softly, but with iron. My son wore that the night they took him. I found it beneath the floorboards, along with the blood. They told me he was lost to illness, then to exile, then to madness, but they never thought I would find this. The archivist dared a whisper. Why now? The queen's eyes flashed. Because the king will die soon, and when he does, they will choose a new heir. She stepped closer to the wall, pointed to a scroll encased behind glass. They will write a lie. But if this is real, the boy said, why not bring it to the council? Show them. Demand justice. The queen turned to him fully, and in that moment she looked not like a widow or a ghost, but like a monarch who had seen behind the veil. They already know, she said, the ones who mattered. They helped cover it, to protect the line, to prevent war, to keep the illusion alive. She placed her hand against the stone. The only thing more dangerous than a lie is a truth too terrible to be told. For a moment silence reigned, only the faint hiss of the candle, only the weight of 100 hidden stories pressing in from every direction. And then the Queen spoke again, this time to the candle itself. "I want you to copy it," she said. "Record every piece, encrypt it, hide it where no one would think to look, under trade ledgers, in poetry, in prayers. Smuggle it into the archives like contraband." The archivist nodded. "And if they find it?" "They won't," she said. "Not until I'm dead." He dared to ask one more question. "And when they do?" The Queen's smile was thin, cold, certain. "They'll know the truth was never lost, just waiting." Then she turned and climbed the stairs alone. The chamber without light. The boy they said had died, the prince, was spoken of less and less as the years crept by. His name had not been uttered in court in a generation. His painted portrait was quietly removed from the Hall of Airs. The musicians no longer played his favourite hymn, and in the chapel, where once a candle burned beside his name, only dust and the faint outline of wax remained. But not all forgot him. There were whispers, not just in the servants' quarters, but in the mouths of those who passed through the castle only briefly, scribes, emissaries, midwives, and guardsmen, who remembered things they were told not to. Some swore the boy never died, that he'd been smuggled away during the eclipse. Others whispered he'd gone mad and been locked in the East Tower, where the windows were bricked shut. But the oldest tale came from the stables, passed from hand to hand like a tale meant to frighten squires, that below the old granary, beneath a false floor, was a chamber where no torch could stay lit, a room where the air refused to carry sound and the stone remembered screams, a chamber without light. No one had seen it, no one, that is, until a mason was brought in to survey the crumbling grain vault after a summer collapse. He had been hired to assess the damage. He returned pale, shaking, silent. He refused payment. He left the city that same day and never returned. What he found was kept quiet. The steward made sure of it. But months later, a letter arrived at the abbey outside the city, a confession. The mason wrote that the floor had given way in one corner, that he'd fallen into a hollow chamber, that he'd found marks on the stone, not carvings but scratches, dug deep with fingernails, long, repetitive, spiralling, and that in the dust there were bones, too small to belong to a grown man. But what chilled him most, he said, was the chain, one end still, bolted to the wall, the other snapped, as if someone had broken free. The confession was unsigned. It was delivered without a return mark. But the abbot who received it placed the letter in a sealed envelope and passed it to the Queen's courier. He wrote no cover note. He gave no explanation. He simply whispered, "She will know what this means." And she did. Because the Queen had seen that chain once before, in her dreams, the kind that came not in sleep, but in fever. In that same week, a servant disappeared, a silent one, mute from birth. She had served the court's apothecary for a decade, and was known for her stillness, her steady hands, and her habit of leaving red petals on the Queen's windowsill. One night, she simply vanished. But the Queen found a message waiting, carved into the wood of her chamber door, so faint it could only be seen in the right light. He remembers. She ordered the door removed. Had it burned? She said nothing to the council, but she ordered the royal midwife brought to her chambers at once. The midwife had served under 3 monarchs. She had delivered every child of the blood for 40 years. When the Queen asked her, "Did he truly die?" the midwife looked at her, lips trembling, and said, "Which one?" The Queen froze. "There was a second," she whispered. The old woman shook her head. "No, my lady, not a second child, a second death." The Queen's voice was stone. "Speak plainly." And the midwife, her eyes wet now, said, The boy they told you had died was not the first they claimed was gone. There was another, before you, before even the last queen, a child of shadow, hidden, taken, forgotten. But why? The queen whispered. The midwife hesitated, then leaned close. Because he was born under the serpent star. That meant little to the queen, but to the old order, the ones who still followed the zodiacal laws, it meant a child born on a cursed alignment, a king marked not for greatness but for ruin. Was he killed? She asked. The midwife's silence answered for her. No, the queen breathed. He was locked away. The old woman nodded. They say the chamber was built for him, and that he never stopped whispering in the dark. The queen stood then, walked to the window, and stared across the old grain fields, where the granary still stood, hollow now, untouched. They never opened it again, the midwife said. They should have, the queen replied. The Boy in the Iron Script. In the cathedral archives, there existed a document no one ever read. It was shelved without title, bound in grey goat hide, and kept behind a false panel in a locked room even the archivist avoided. Most thought it a myth. Fewer believed it had any meaning, but one storm-heavy night, as wind howled through the flying buttresses and the bells rang without touch, the Queen's confessor sent for it. He arrived with no candle, requested no company, and disappeared behind the panel for 3 hours. When he returned, he was shaking. He did not sleep again for 3 days. What he read was not a confession, nor a prayer, nor any royal decree. It was a transcription of a voice, written line by line in cramped, frantic script. Iron gall ink, brittle now with age. The margins were smeared with soot, and the parchment was pierced in places, as though stabbed through by a desperate stylus. There were no dates, no names, only phrases that circled and repeated and sometimes broke into foreign tongues, but between the madness there were patterns, references to the boy behind the wall, to the one who sings to the stones, to chains that remember. Most haunting of all, the recurring line, "He is still there." The confessor handed the book to the Queen without a word. She did not open it. She burned it in the hearth of her chamber while the priest watched and wept silently. She told him to speak none of it to the king, but by then it was too late. Because the king had already heard it. Not the book. The voice. One night, while walking alone through the lower halls, he had stopped by the chapel for prayer. No guards, no servants. He liked the solitude, the echo, the stone. He knelt, but before he could whisper the Lord's name, he heard humming, not music, not chant, humming, a single steady childish note echoing off the walls. He stood, turned. No one. He searched behind the columns, pulled aside the old tapestry. Nothing. But the note did not stop. It grew louder, closer, until it seemed to come not from the chapel at all, but beneath it. He pressed his ear to the floor, to the ancient tile. The note stopped. And then a whisper. "I remember you." He fled, told no one. But that week he summoned the royal architect and ordered the complete diagram of the castle's foundations. They brought scroll after scroll, some over a century old. One in particular had no title, but bore the sigil of a forgotten architect, Matteo de Lune, known for designing crypts, prisons, and secret chapels for kings afraid of their heirs. On this scroll, tucked between the known cellar and the servants' tunnel, was a chamber marked only as Sanctum Obscura. No door, no access, only a dotted line from the old grain vault leading down. The king asked, "Was it ever built?" The architect hesitated. "Yes, your majesty, but it was sealed during the Third War of Succession. Legend says it was cursed. The masons refused to work down there after the first season." "Why?" They said, "Something was already inside." The king went pale. "Get me the royal mason, quietly." at night and bring oil lamps." That night, under cover of storm and shadow, the king and his mason descended into the old granary vault, where the air had the weight of forgotten things. The stone was damp, the air tight as cloth, and the walls slick with salt. The mason worked without speaking, tracing the outline of the false floor. He found it, removed a single slab, beneath it, darkness. A hole 2 cubits wide, too smooth to be natural. The king lowered a lamp. The flame guttered, then vanished. "No air," he whispered. "Rope." They tied him in, lowered him into the black. 10 feet, 15. The stone opened into a square chamber. He landed on what he thought was old cloth, but it cracked. Bones. He turned the lamp in a circle. The walls were scratched. The floor was littered with symbols, faint, circular, spiraling inward. And in the far corner, iron. A manacle, snapped. Beside it, a sliver of cloth. Royal blue, faded. He reached to touch it, and heard breath, a soft exhale, right behind him. He turned, nothing, but the flame died in his lamp, and the rope went taut. They pulled him up, faster than they had lowered him. He emerged, shaking, eyes wide, covered in cold dust. He said nothing, simply handed the cloth to the mason. The king looked at it. On the edge, a crest, old, faint, but his family's, not the current generation, older, one not spoken of, a brother, an uncle, a cousin, a forgotten prince. The king went pale and spoke only 4 words, "Seal it again, forever." But it would not stay sealed, because the next day, in the queen's chamber, the red petals returned. Only this time they were not placed gently on the sill. They were spelled, arranged in the shape of a name, one long lost, a boy who should have been king, a prince erased from history. And in that moment, the queen finally understood. This was no ghost, no hallucination. This was remembrance. The past had not been buried, it had been chained, and now the chain was broken. The whisper that wore a crown. Before the boy vanished, he had been called the Little King. Not because he ruled, not because he was crowned, but because he was loved. More than his older brothers, more than his father. He walked the corridors and old men bowed to him. He wandered into kitchens and the cooks gave him bread. He sat on the chapel steps and the monks taught him Latin, and then Hebrew, and then silence. Even the Queen Mother smiled when he passed, and that was the beginning of the end. Because the boy did not know how many thrones there were, or how many sons the king had, or how close love could come to becoming a sentence. He only knew he wanted to sing. He sang in the halls, in the stables, in the echoing stone crypts where other children were afraid to go. He sang to rats and to birds, and sometimes to nothing at all. The castle servants began to say strange things, that when the boy sang, their pains ceased, that bad dreams stopped, that clocks froze, that when he hummed outside a chamber, arguments inside would fall quiet and never resume. They called it charm, innocence. Some said divinity, but others saw it for what it really was, power, and in royal bloodlines, power not granted is power hunted. So the boy was removed from court, quietly, without a record. His name scratched from the chapel roll. His chamber tapestries taken down in the night. The queen was told he had died of fever. She screamed for 3 days and refused food. The servants lit candles and whispered prayers. But the Chancellor of Records did not believe. He was an old man then, bookish, fussy, fond of maps and old poetry. He had taught the boy how to trace runes and read royal lineages. The boy had left him a poem the night he vanished, scrawled on old vellum, folded once, tucked between pages of the great annals. It read only, "If stones remember, then I am not lost. If silence he speaks, then I will return. If you hear the humming, I am free." The Chancellor locked the note away and waited. He waited 26 years, until the humming returned. It began on the feast day of St. Evermond. As bells rang and dancers filled the courtyard, the Chancellor passed beneath the old South Tower, the one built over the former chapel, and stopped. Because he heard something, just faintly, a single note, thin, high, familiar, he turned, trembling. Then he smiled, a smile that did not fade, even as tears began to fall. Later that evening, he returned to his office, lit one candle, opened the annals, removed the folded poem, and wrote 5 new words beneath it. He is not finished yet. He died that night, peacefully. But the Queen found the note, and the humming, it spread. Now heard in the towers, in the old cellar, in the broken pipe organ, in the cistern beneath the Queen's garden. Even the guards, once silent skeptics, began to whisper, "The boy is back." But if that were true, then who had locked him away? Who had erased him? And why had the royal line never spoken his name? In the private chapel beneath the palace, there hung a painting, unlabelled, untitled, hidden behind a crimson veil, and viewed only by queens. It showed a woman standing beside a child, not holding his hand, not crowning him, shielding him, one arm stretched behind her as though to block a sword. The child's face had been scratched away by time, but not completely. A trace of his eye remained, not afraid, not weeping, smiling. The Queen studied this image every winter solstice, and after the humming returned, she stood before it longer than usual, until she finally said aloud, "He is coming back, isn't he?" The confessor beside her said only, "Majesty, he never left." She turned, startled, and for the first time in 30 years she whispered the name, Theomund. It tasted like blood and honey. It echoed through the chapel like a prayer half forgotten. But no thunder answered, no storm, no collapse of stone, just silence, as though something had been waiting for its name. And now that it had been spoken, it was listening again. Word spread, not officially, never in proclamation or decree, but in glances, whispers. Old songs sung by washerwomen who should not have known the tune. In chalk, circles drawn on the castle stones, erased by dawn, and in the dreams of those who had once wronged the boy. The Chancellor of Gold awoke screaming one night, clawing at his robes. He said the rats spoke to him in the boy's voice. The former spymaster jumped from the tower wall, muttering the word forgiven over and over. The Master of Arms locked himself in the armoury and lit 100 candles before choking on his own blade. None of these were investigated, but the Queen took note. She did not mourn them, nor did she exonerate them. She simply turned to her confessor and said, "It's beginning." In a hidden part of the castle, behind the old music chamber where no child had played in 100 years, there was a door that hadn't been opened since the night the boy vanished, carved from ash, lined with brass. It bore no lock, only a sigil, a circle within a circle, a chain. The Queen ordered it opened. No guards, no scribes, just her and the confessor. Inside, a small room, dust-choked, airless, but in the centre, a cradle, and inside it, a single object, a crown, not gold, not jewel-encrusted, but wood, old, cracked, the one the boy had worn in his games when he was the little king. The Queen reached out and lifted it. It disintegrated in her hands, and from beneath it, untouched by dust, a fresh rose petal, blood red, still wet. The boy in the wall, the humming didn't stop. In fact, it grew louder. But it didn't come from the chapel, or the music room, or the towers. No. Now it came from inside the walls. Servants whispered about footsteps where there were no floors. Maids swore they heard lullabies echoing behind the tapestries. A chamberlain fled screaming from the Queen's west hallway, claiming he'd seen a small, pale hand reach through the stone itself. And in the silence that followed, the court divided, those who feared the boy and those who waited for him. Because now, more than a century after his vanishing, people began to speak his name openly, Theomund, the little king, but not as a memory, as a presence. They said he had become something else, not ghost, not myth, but an echo that had gained weight, that had grown teeth, that had learned patience, and now he wanted his story told. In the royal library, the Book of Lineage had always listed 12 sons of the High King, each with their title, their coat of arms, their fate. Until one morning it listed 13. No one had changed it, no quill, no ink, no parchment out of place, just a name in the margin, a tiny curling script unlike any other in the book. Theomund, last born, disappeared, returned. The historian who found it fainted. When she awoke, the name was still there. The queen grew quiet. She stopped attending council. She dismissed her scribes. She stood alone at night beneath the stone arch where the boy had once sung, where the ivy now grew over the corners of the flagstones like veins over an old wound. She would stay there until dawn, her lips barely moving as if remembering something forbidden. One morning the confessor found her there, hands trembling, and she finally spoke. "He's here." The confessor nodded slowly. "You always knew he'd come back." The queen looked up, eyes old but not defeated. "No, I always knew he'd choose to." That same night the castle thundered with a sound that hadn't been heard in generations, singing, not a boy's voice, not a man's, something in between, untrained, wild, but beautiful. Guards froze mid-step, dogs sat and tilted their heads. A child in the lower kitchens began humming along in his sleep, and in the queen's chamber the roses, once dead in their vase, began to bloom again. When the royal crypt was opened for the winter rite, the priest descended with 2 squires. They never reached the tombs. At the first bend in the corridor, they all stopped. The squire dropped his torch, because light was already coming from the passage, a pale blue glow, flickering like candlelight but cold. The priest knelt, unbidden. The squires joined him. They didn't speak about what they saw, but when they returned to the surface, their faces were damp with tears, and their hair, just slightly, had gone white. Soon, reports poured in from outside the castle. Farmers spoke of a boy who appeared at the edge of fields. He said nothing, just smiled, sometimes hummed, and when he vanished, crops that had failed for a decade began to grow. A stable hand said he woke one morning to find every lame horse on the estate standing strong. A knight claimed his dead wife appeared in a dream, whispering, "The boy is mending the wound." Even the river, once sluggish with drought, surged with sudden life. In the old legends there was a phrase once carved into a forgotten church bell. "When the child returns, the crown must listen." The queen had heard it once as a girl, carved into the wall of a ruined tower, just before it collapsed in a storm. She remembered it now, and she ordered the great council convened. For the first time in 50 years every noble came, not because they were summoned, but because they were afraid not to. Some denied the child, called it heresy, madness, others believed. More than a few fell to their knees when the humming filled the hall just as the queen stood to speak. She held no sword, no scroll, only the old poem the boy had left behind. She read it aloud, and for a moment time did seem to stop. When she finished, the hall was silent, and then a laugh, light, clear, childlike, but not from the queen, from somewhere above. They all turned upward, but saw nothing, only a stone ceiling, and yet they all heard it, and each heard something different in that voice, their greatest joy, their oldest guilt, their first lullaby, their forgotten name. The queen issued no decree. There was no coronation, no parade, no coin minted in his image. Only one change was made. In the royal archive, the portrait of the 12 sons, long thought complete, was altered. An empty 13th frame, once left blank, now bore a new painted face, small, soft-eyed, smiling, and beneath it, the painting. No one finished. They claimed no artist painted it. The frame for the 13th child had been empty for over a century. Countless hands had tried to fill it, masters with royal commissions, apprentices chasing fame, but none succeeded. Some abandoned it in frustration, others died before finishing a single stroke. The canvas remained bare, until one morning it simply wasn't. A face appeared, soft, young, and impossibly serene, not quite boy, not yet man. His gaze didn't follow you like most portraits. It waited for you, quietly, as if it had always been watching, but only now allowed itself to be seen. The archivist who discovered it claimed the ink on the nameplate was still wet. Teomund, rightful heir, lost, remembered, returned. No brush marks, no pigment inconsistencies, no records of anyone entering the vault. And yet, the dust around the frame had been disturbed, as if small fingers had leaned against the glass from the inside. News spread in whispers first, then songs. Children sang a rhyme that hadn't existed the day before. He walked the halls with silent feet. He left no prints, no breath, no heat. But if you hum and bow your head, he'll bring you back what time made dead. Parents scolded them, thinking it a cruel game. But when one child who had been mute from birth began humming that very tune, her family fell to their knees and wept. In the castle, doors began to open on their own. Not violently, gently, almost politely, especially the door no one had touched for 60 years, the boys' nursery. The Queen stood before it one morning at sunrise, her hand trembling over the latch. It opened before she touched it. Inside, not a speck of dust. No decay, just sunlight, warm, golden sunlight, falling across a small cot with velvet blankets. On the windowsill sat a carved wooden horse, one ear chipped, a tiny crown branded on its flank. Ian stepped forward and placed something beside it. A slipper. The one found in the ivy so long ago. As it touched the wood, the air shifted, the shadows softened. A soft hum filled the room. She whispered, "You can rest now." But something in the room seemed to answer, "Not yet." The confessor grew pale in those days. He spoke little, but when he did, it was with the voice of someone who had seen too much. He claimed the old king's diary had begun writing itself. Its pages, once blank, now held entries dated years after the king's death, entries written in his precise hand. They spoke of regret, of debt unpaid, of a boy wronged. But most disturbing of all was the final entry. The crown will not last unless it kneels. He does not want revenge, he wants truth. Give him what was stolen, give him his name. The confessor showed the Queen. She closed the book and ordered it buried deep. That didn't stop it. In the mountain villages, snow melted in midsummer around small footprints that led nowhere. In the northern abbeys, monks found ancient scrolls with fresh ink. All of them spoke of a hidden son, a song of return, and a king crowned without crown. In the eastern woods, a hunter claimed he saw a boy walking barefoot over ice. He did not shiver. He smiled. And when the hunter bowed, the ice beneath him did not crack. It wasn't just haunting anymore. It was a movement. Courtiers began wearing thistle pins, the boy's symbol, on their cloaks, claiming loyalty not to the present king, but the forgotten heir. Artists drew sketches of the 13th child with halos made of starlight, or cloaked in firelight, or holding a mirror in which the viewer always saw their younger self. A new phrase entered the court tongue, whispered rather than said aloud, Theomund lives. Not physically, perhaps, but as idea, as presence, as judgment. One day the bells in the ruined chapel rang. They hadn't worked in 80 years. No rope was attached, no wind stirred them, but they rang just the same, and the Queen, now old and near her final days, walked out to the bell tower alone. She climbed every step, her knees buckling, her breath shallow, but she reached the top and sat beside the largest bell. She waited, and just before sunset she heard it again, that humming, a boy's hum, coming not from outside, but from within the very metal of the bell. She closed her eyes, and this time she sang with him. The Queen died that night, peacefully. No physicians were summoned, no fanfare, just a note found beneath her pillow. He forgave me, he never hated me, he was always singing. I was the one who stopped listening. When her coffin was carried to the royal tombs, the funeral procession halted at the base of the staircase. Every torch extinguished itself. Silence fell. And from the crypt's shadow came a soft glow. A boy's shape. Just for a moment. He looked up at them, smiled, then turned and vanished into the dark. The 13th frame in the royal painting remains unchanged to this day. The ink is still wet. The boy still smiles, and every year, on the anniversary of his vanishing, a single red rose is found on the nursery windowsill. No footsteps, no handprints, just the scent of something that had waited a very, very long time to finally be remembered, and the humming continues, through the walls, through the wind, through the centuries, because the boy was never truly gone. He was only waiting for someone to listen. The boy in the mirror. There were rules in the palace. Rules no one wrote down, yet everyone obeyed. Never enter the West Tower after dusk. Never hum in the Queen's garden. And never, under any circumstances, speak to the boy in the mirror, because he does speak back. It started with the maid who dropped a basin in the hall of portraits. She bent to pick up the broken shards and saw something that made her scream, not her own reflection. A boy, pale, silent, smiling, but not menacingly. His eyes were calm, his hands pressed lightly to the glass. He looked almost lonely. The maid said he mouthed one word. Almost. She didn't understand. No one did. But the Chamberlain ordered that every mirror on that floor be covered or removed, not out of fear, but reverence, as if protecting something sacred, or shielding the palace from guilt it couldn't admit aloud. Still, the sightings grew. In the library, the royal tutor claimed the pages of a forgotten manuscript reflected a face not her own. In the ballroom, dancers halted mid-waltz when the windows, clouded with breath, briefly revealed a small figure watching from within the frost. In the crypt, a priest reported that during Mass, the polished coffin of the first king shimmered, and in the silver gleam of its trim a child appeared, always the same age, always silent, and always watching. Theories flooded the court. Some said he was a ghost, others whispered he was alive, hidden in some far-off monastery, projecting his image by ancient magic or divine right. A few scholars believed he wasn't a person at all, but a memory given shape, born of collective guilt, sustained by centuries of silence. But the old nurse, now blind with age, said something no one forgot. He's not trapped in the mirror, we are. The current king, descended not from the 13th child, but from the brother who took the throne, became obsessed. He ordered every record re-examined, secret vaults opened, tombs exhumed. In one such vault they found a forgotten chest. Inside, a pair of boots, child-sized, a wooden sword, and a letter sealed in wax with the royal crest. It was addressed to "My Little Flame." No one could trace the handwriting, but when read aloud, The walls of the chamber grew warm, almost summer-like, and the final line read, "If they never let you speak, if they never let you reign, remember, even silence shapes the world." Then came the day the mirror cracked. It was a plain mirror, hung in the servants' corridor, no frame, no carvings, and yet it shattered at noon, no wind, no quake, no hand touching it. The break was strange, not chaotic, not random, a perfect spiral, etched outward from a single point where a child's finger might rest. But the palace mason swore something else. There was no glass on the floor. It didn't fall out. It turned to ash. He lifted his hand. Ash marked his palm in the shape of a crown. The palace declared a day of mourning. Not officially, not in proclamation. But the kitchens went quiet, the musicians refused to play, and even the children, usually shrieking through the courtyards, sat hushed beside the fountains. No one said why. They simply felt it. A passing, or perhaps a shift. As if the boy, long patient, had moved a step closer. The Queen Regent, a scholar herself, took to reading ancient law. She found something peculiar, a clause buried in a dusty translation from the old tongue. No heir shall be declared until all rightful names are sung. She summoned historians, linguists, and singers. They argued for weeks. But one bard, half mad from grief, half blind from age, came forth with a song passed down only in whispers, the Song of the Lost Prince. It had 13 verses. Only 12 had ever been sung. The 13th was forbidden, said to open not a deux-cœurs, but a mirror. They sang it anyway, in the great hall, candles lit in a circle of 13, each note rising like breath from stone, each word older than memory, and as the final line echoed, a mirror long sealed behind a tapestry began to ripple, not break, not shatter, but ripple, like the surface of a still pond stirred by a breeze no one felt. And in its depths he appeared again, not as ghost, not as illusion, but as boy, real, whole, and smiling. The Queen stepped forward and bowed, deeply, not as monarch to subject, but as mother to son. And though the mirror remained cold to the touch, something passed between them, an understanding, not of vengeance, not of justice, but of belonging. She spoke one word, Theomund. The boy nodded once, then turned, and walked into the light behind him, gone, but not lost. From that day forward the mirror stayed blank, no face, no glow, no movement, but it was never removed. It became a shrine, a reminder. That power stolen can be reclaimed. That truth silenced can still sing, that the 13th child may never wear a crown, but in being remembered he reigns all the same. In the margins of palace books, a phrase began to appear, inked in childish script, "I am not gone, I am still humming," and in every mirror, if you stood long enough and listened hard enough, you'd swear the glass vibrated ever so slightly, as if waiting for your voice to join his. The burial that never happened. They say every murder leaves behind a trail, blood, bones, a body to bury, but in this case there was none. No grave, no tomb, no stone carved with the prince's name. Because the 13th son, Theomund, had no death, at least not one anyone ever admitted. The official scrolls, preserved in gold leaf script, list his name among the royal children, but with an asterisk, just one small mark, and beside it a single word, absent. Not deceased, not lost, just missing. It's a strange designation for a royal child, especially one said to have vanished in the most protected fortress in the kingdom. The whispers began only weeks after his disappearance. A hunting accident, they said, or a fall from a high window, or a fever that came and went so quickly the court physicians barely had time to name it, but none of these were written down. Instead, in the diary of a stable boy, found centuries later between the pages of a hollowed-out Bible, one sentence tells a different story. The prince walked into the chapel that night and never came out. Only the bell tolled once, and then never again. That chapel, still standing but locked to this day, was once called the Chapel of the Pale Flame. Named, it was believed, for a single candle that never went out. Lit on the night of Teoman's birth, and extinguished, according to an eyewitness priest, the very hour he disappeared. No wind, no hand. It just flickered once, and died. But it wasn't just the chapel. The palace itself changed. The wind through the east corridor always seemed colder after that. The clocks in the nursery never struck midnight again, stopping at 11:53, the precise time of the prince's last recorded breath as a newborn, gasping beneath a lunar eclipse, and in the Queen Mother's garden, the white lilies, planted in his honour, withered in full sun. No disease, no drought, just refuse. Al to bloom. As if mourning something the living dared not. In the vaults beneath the palace, the royal family's tombs line the walls. Marble effigies of kings and queens, princes and daughters. Each carved with lifelike eyes that seem to follow you. But among them is a sealed alcove. Unmarked, no statue, no name, just a slab of jet-black stone polished to a mirror-like gleam. Those who visit it report hearing strange things, a heartbeat, a lullaby, or, most hauntingly, scratching. From the inside, a forgotten monk once claimed to have spent the night beside it, praying. When morning came, he was found unconscious, with ash coating his lips, and carved into the stone, though no tool had touched it, was a single word, unburied. This is where the legend fractures. Some believe the prince was murdered by his own blood, a sacrifice to maintain a fragile lineage. Others claim he was hidden away, too dangerous, too powerful, too loved. But the most persistent tale is the strangest of all, that his body never died, that it was taken into the mirror world, preserved in silvered time, neither aging nor fading, waiting, not for rescue, but for recognition. Centuries passed, and yet, each time the crown changed heads, something peculiar happened. During the coronation, at the exact moment the crown touched the new monarch's head, a shadow would pass across the great hall's north window. No one outside, no clouds overhead, but a shadow, child-shaped, small, still, watching, and gone before the crowd could turn. This occurred every time, unfailingly, until one coronation 50 years ago, when the shadow did not appear. Instead, the crown cracked in two. No explanation, no impact, just a hairline fracture along the golden band, as if refusing to be worn, as if waiting for another head. Modern historians called it superstition. Coincidence? But the royal archivist, an old man with failing hands and sharper memory, once muttered a warning in the echoing hall of records. He's not haunting us, we are haunting him. And perhaps that is the truth no one dared face, that the murder never ended. Because without a body there can be no justice, without a grave there can be no closure, and without a name spoken aloud there can be no peace. The murder of Prince Teomund may not have been an act of violence, it may have been something worse, an erasure, a chosen silence, a burial not of flesh, but of memory. Now, in the modern wing of the Royal Museum, there stands a painting once believed lost, unfinished, unsigned, unframed. It depicts a boy in a crimson tunic, standing on a cliff at sunrise, holding a single lily. But if you step back far enough, the background reveals something more, The cliff is the shape of a crown, and beneath it, shadowed in faint grey, are 12 hooded figures standing with their backs turned. The title? 13, One Watching. It was hung without ceremony, but each year, on the date of Teomund's disappearance, someone leaves a lily beneath it. No one knows who, no one ever sees it placed, but it's always fresh, always white, and always alone. The forger's revelation. In the smoky alleys of the old city, far from the marble spires and royal salons, there lived a man known only as Marek the Forger. No last name, no birth record, just whispered tales of a man who could copy anything, seals, scrolls, signets, with such precision that even the royal scribes once mistakenly authenticated one of his works as genuine. Marek had worked in shadow for decades, for criminals, rebels, merchants, even minor nobles who wished to invent lineage from long-dead dynasties. But near the end of his life, he left behind one confession, not in ink, but in fire. A burnt notebook was discovered under his floorboards after his death in 1891. Most pages were lost to ash, but a few charred fragments survived, sealed between slate. One of them bore these words, scrawled in trembling script. They made me recreate the prince's death scroll, but no such scroll existed. Another read, no witness, no seal, only an instruction, make it look like grief. And on the last, barely legible through smoke, the boy was never meant to vanish. He was meant to be forgotten. This was the moment historians began to turn. What if Prince Teomund's disappearance wasn't a tragedy, but a design? What if it wasn't murder at all, but something worse, something carefully orchestrated to leave no trace? Theories bloomed. The prince as a political liability, the prince as a prophetic threat, the prince as a bastard born under dangerous omens. But it was the forger's final phrase, make it look like grief, that sent chills through the archives. Because the official mourning portrait of Teomund, housed in the deepest wing of the royal reliquary, always struck art historians as off. Not for its craftsmanship. It was beautiful, almost divine. But because of one strange detail, the child in the painting had no shadow. At first, scholars blamed poor preservation, oil, loss, flaking varnish. But after careful X-ray scanning in 2009, a startling discovery emerged. The original underpainting showed a clear shadow, long, distinct, stretching eastward. But at some point, after the piece had been completed, it was painted over. Not by the original artist, but someone else. Someone with less skill and a different agenda. Why remove a shadow? Unless perhaps the child casting it was still alive. And if that were true, where had he gone? This is where the narrative fractures into 3 competing theories, each with loyal believers, each more bizarre than the last. The sanctuary theory says Teomund was taken by the Silent Order, a cloister of monks who believed the boy was touched by divinity. They whisked him away beneath the catacombs, raising him as a silent seer whose face was never seen again. They say he lived into his 60s, writing prophecies in chalk on stone walls, all of which were erased by the crown decades later. But not all. One fragment remains in the ruins of the monastery chapel, etched beneath the pulpit. The crown will rot when it forgets the name it buried. The second theory is darker still. The dagger theory claims Teomund never left the palace, that he died by poison or blade, and his remains were hidden in a secret chamber beneath the royal nursery, entombed behind the marble hearth. This idea stems from a renovation log discovered in 1740, detailing the unexpected removal of sealed stonework in the east wing, behind a child's fireplace, and a strange note. Bones too small for a dog, wrapped in crimson. The fire was never lit again in that room, and to this day, palace staff refer to it only as the quiet room. Visitors say it feels colder than the others, and some hear a lullaby when standing alone. But the third theory is the most persistent and the most feared. The doppelganger theory. It argues the prince was never missing at all, that he lived, grew up, and even ascended briefly as someone else. Some believe another child, identical in appearance, was placed in his stead for reasons unknown, perhaps to manipulate succession, perhaps to fulfill a prophecy too dangerous to leave unchecked. But others argue something even stranger, that the real Theomund became someone else, not through disguise or deception, but through forgetting, that his identity was stripped not only from the world, but from himself. No records, no mirrors, no name. Just a boy raised to believe he was no one, a royal erased from both memory and mind, and that somewhere in the far corners of the realm he lived out his life unaware of who he truly was. A forgotten prince in a peasant's skin, a boy with royal blood who never knew he bled it. This theory has no documents, no scrolls, no witnesses, only a strange cluster of legends, all telling the same tale from distant villages across the realm. They speak of a boy who arrived without a past, bearing a mark behind his left ear, 3 dots in a triangle, like the birthmark Theomund was known to. Oh, have. They speak of how animals followed him, how storms seemed to circle where he stood, and how, when he sang, glass would hum. He never stayed long in one place, and he always disappeared before his 20th birthday. But wherever he went, lilies grew, even in winter. One elderly woman, before her death in 1938, told a story to her granddaughter. He was kind, sad, beautiful, but his eyes weren't his own. It was as if someone had borrowed them. When shown the royal portrait decades later, the granddaughter, now an old woman herself, went pale. "That's him," she said. "That's the boy from my grandmother's story." She wasn't pointing at the face. She was pointing at the shadow that wasn't there. So what is the truth? Did Theomund die? Was he hidden? Did he live and forget? Or did history rewrite itself so thoroughly that even now we'll never know? Only one thing is certain. Someone, somewhere, went to impossible lengths to erase a child. And still, he lingers, in portraits with no shadow, in tombs with no name, in the crown that cracked itself rather than be worn by a lie. The murder of Prince Theomund may be the greatest royal crime never confessed, and perhaps in that silence lies its power, not in the act, but in the absence. A prince with no body, a death with no date, and a kingdom that forgot because it had to. The chamber that shouldn't exist. In 1976, renovations began on the east wing of the royal palace, an area long closed off to the public, long ignored by even the most dedicated stewards of the realm. The wing was meant to be converted into a new exhibit, a gallery celebrating childhood through the royal ages. It was a quiet project, no headlines, no fanfare, until the workers broke through a false wall behind an arched alcove in the nursery corridor. Behind it was a sealed wooden door, centuries old, reinforced with 3 iron bars bolted shut from the outside. There was no keyhole, no markings, no record of its construction, and yet it had been deliberately sealed and, more strangely, forgotten. When the iron bars were removed and the door slowly pulled open, those present reported an overwhelming scent of old lavender and dust, as if time itself had been preserved inside. And there it was, a chamber, small, octagonal, silent. Walls lined with pale blue silk, ceiling painted like the night sky, flecked with gold leaf stars. At the centre, a child-sized chair, ornate but crude, not a throne, not even a royal seat, just a chair facing the wall. And behind that chair, carved into the stone in jagged script, "I must not speak, I must not look, I must not be." There was no blood, no skeleton, no bones, just dust and silence. And that sense, palpable to all who entered, that something had once been very wrong here. News of the room's discovery was quickly buried. The workers were paid off. The exhibit was quietly cancelled. And that door, it was resealed, cemented over, as if the whole thing had never happened. But one photographer who had slipped a camera past the guards leaked a single photo to a local paper years later, a blurred black and white image of the empty chair beneath the painted stars. Within days, every copy of the issue vanished from shelves. Every archive microfilm was replaced, and the photographer was never seen again. He had left behind only one note on his desk. He was never meant to sit on the throne. He was meant to sit alone. Scholars call it the lost chamber, but within the palace walls, those who still whisper its name use a different term, the listening room, because of the stories from guards posted nearby, of hearing footsteps echo where no one walked, of a child's voice humming when the wind passed through the walls, of eyes felt but never seen, and once, only once, of a single knock from behind the sealed wall. A knock that came on the anniversary of Teomund's disappearance, and then never again. Some believe this was where the prince was hidden, his existence erased not through death but through containment. Not to protect him, but to protect others from him. There were old legends, even in his time, whispers that Teomund had been born beneath a red comet, that he never cried as an infant, that animals in the palace either adored him or fled from him entirely, that he once looked into a mirror at age 4 and screamed for an hour before the glass shattered. The royal court dismissed it all, of course. Superstition, nonsense. But the listening room suggests otherwise. What kind of power or fear would compel an entire royal line to build a chamber not to kill a child, but to contain him, and then forget, deliberately, systematically? Even in the palace's most secret annals, there is no mention of the room, no blueprints, no servant logs, no shift rotations, as if memory itself was wiped clean. But memory is a stubborn thing. It leaves echoes, cracks in the porcelain of history. And one such crack appeared in a letter discovered just 5 years ago, tucked behind a loose stone in a village chapel's wall. It was dated 1402, a century after Teomund vanished. It bore no signature, no seal, only a single line. The boy in the stars still watches. He remembers what we tried to forget. Some dismissed it as poetic nonsense. But astronomers who examined the ceiling of the listening room, preserved from the 1976 photograph, noticed something curious. The star map wasn't random. It matched the night sky of one specific date, October 12, 1302. The night Teomund disappeared. Every star, every planet, even the position of the moon, accurate to the hour, meaning someone had stood in that room the night it happened, looked up, and painted what they saw. Was it Teomund? Was it someone watching him? Or was it a mark, a timestamp anchoring the event to the heavens? Whatever the truth, one thing is undeniable. That chamber was not a tomb. It was a prison. And yet, the final question remains. Did he stay there until his death? Or did someone, or something, free him? There are no answers, only patterns. Royal seals slightly altered in the years after his disappearance. Strange fluctuations in palace account books, entries listed under names that were later removed entirely. Letters from noble families begging for a resolution to the inheritance confusion, though no official dispute was recorded. All signs of a shadow behind the throne. A presence both felt and denied, and a kingdom straining to maintain a lie it had long forgotten how to explain. Perhaps Teomund died alone in that chamber, or perhaps he escaped and walked among us, nameless and unseen. Perhaps he lives still in the corners of stories, behind the masks of strangers, woven into lullabies that end to a brew. P a lie. Because the truth is, some murders are not moments. They are erasures. Not a knife, not a poison, but a slow, intentional drowning of a soul in silence. The most mysterious royal murder in history may never have been a murder at all, but something colder, more deliberate, a rewriting of reality so complete, even the stars had to keep the secret, and the boy at its centre, he may still be watching, from behind the wall, from behind the mask, from behind the name that was taken and never returned. The Puppet King, after Prince Teomund's disappearance, the throne did not remain vacant for long. A distant cousin, barely 12, was swiftly declared heir and crowned within the same moon cycle. His name was Alaric, a boy from a lesser branch of the royal family, unremarkable, quiet, sickly from birth. Few had heard of him before. Fewer still believed he would last a year on the throne, and yet he reigned for 35. Not with fire or brilliance, but with an eerie consistency. No wars, no rebellions, no major proclamations, just silence, stillness, and an uncanny, fragile peace. His court became known for its emptiness. Visitors often remarked that walking the halls of the palace under King Alaric felt like wandering a tomb. Advisors rarely spoke. Tapestries were left unchanged for decades. Even music, once a pillar of royal prestige, was slowly phased out. Instruments vanished, choirs dismissed. It was as though the realm had fallen under a spell, not one of terror, but of quiet, obedient stagnation. The kingdom functioned, crops grew, taxes were collected, the people endured. But behind the scenes, strange fractures were forming. Nobles began to disappear. Records were erased and rewritten. And most chillingly of all, paintings of King Alaric, commissioned yearly, all bore subtle differences. The nose sharper, the eyes darker, the hands changing. Until one artist, in 1337, refused to complete his commission. He claimed the king sitting before him was not the man who had sat for him the year prior. He was arrested 3 days later for treason and hanged without trial. His unfinished portrait was burned, but witnesses claim it showed 2 figures, not one. A boy behind the king's shoulder, eyes wide, hand outstretched toward the crown, and in that hand a silver key. Whispers began to circulate that King Alaric was no king at all, that he was a vessel, a mouthpiece, a puppet, controlled by something or someone, hidden behind the veil of the throne room. The listening room, long since sealed again, became central to these theories. Some believed that Teomund had not died or disappeared. He had simply been absorbed. His body never found because he had been erased in a different way, not killed, but used. There's a single court diary, written in cipher, that survived the purge. It belonged to a scribe named Halwyn, a minor official, tasked with chronicling court decrees. His entries, decrypted only recently, are chilling. In the spring of 1321 he wrote, "The king no longer sleeps. His chambers are empty by midnight, but the guards swear he never leaves. His shadow falls backward. His reflection lags behind him by 2 steps, and his voice is not his own." Later that year, he laughed today, first time in 4 years, but the sound, it was like a child pretending to be a man, like a boy playing king in a costume too large. And then, the final entry, dated the night before Halwyn vanished. "I heard the whisper behind the tapestry. I followed it to the old wing. The door is there. The door is open. He's not alone in there." What Halwyn saw, or thought he saw, we'll never know, but the next morning his quarters were found scorched, not burned, scorched. As if exposed to a heat not from fire, but from something older, stranger, and far more precise. There was no body, only the ink from his final page burned into the wall behind his desk. As if someone, or something, wanted the message remembered. In the final decade of King Alaric's reign, the kingdom began to change. Not in ways the eye could see, but in symbols, in ceremonies. Old rituals were quietly reintroduced. The coronation rites, which had once invoked divine right, now included a new line, "By the silent witness who sees the unseen, we anoint thee," a line that appears nowhere in traditional scripture, and in the royal crest, small changes were made. The lion's eyes were altered, tilted slightly downward, as if they were no longer watching outward, but inward, at something inside the palace, inside the bloodline. When King Alaric finally died in 1341, his funeral was conducted in utter secrecy. No public procession, no state mourning, only a small entourage, cloaked in grey, who bore his body to a chapel that no longer exists on any map. The tomb was sealed without inscription, no effigy, no epitaph, just a slab of stone and a shallow circle carved into its surface like a sun with no rays, and beneath that circle a single word etched in Latin, Reditum, return. The boy king who ruled without joy, without songs and without legacy, his reign ended, but the questions only deepened. Because in the months after his death, visitors began reporting something strange within the palace once more. A room, just a broom closet, supposedly, locked at all times, save for midnight. And when opened, a faint smell of lavender, dust, and starlight, as if the ceiling bore constellations, though no such painting existed, and sometimes, only sometimes, a child's chair, facing the wall. Was King Alaric the real ruler, or just a vessel through which Theomund continued to breathe? Was Theomund ever truly erased? Or had the boy behind the mask become the silent architect of an empire too terrified to name him? Perhaps both were prisoners, perhaps both were kings, or perhaps, just perhaps, the kingdom itself had become the Chur. Amber, a palace of whispers, a throne of lies, a realm ruled not by blood or steel or divine right, but by the echo of a name never spoken again. The archivist's warning, centuries passed, monarchs came and went, wars rose and fell like tides. The great hall where Theomund vanished was bricked up, renamed, forgotten. By the 1600s, the tale of the vanished prince had become little more than courtroom gossip and drunken folklore, half-remembered stories told by firelight to frighten squires and entertain queens bored of political tedium. But not everyone forgot. In 1689, a man named Henri de Laure arrived at the capital with a letter of introduction, a strange accent, and an even stranger request: unlimited access to the royal archives beneath the palace. He claimed to be an archivist from the Order of St. Argento, a secretive ecclesiastical group known more for preserving ancient texts than for meddling in affairs of state. No one thought much of it at first. He wore the robes, he bore the seal, his Latin was flawless, his manners precise. But what raised eyebrows wasn't his access, it was his persistence. He never slept in the royal apartments. He lived underground, literally, beneath the palace, in the lower scriptorium where the stone walls wept water and the air never rose above freezing. There, surrounded by scrolls older than the kingdom itself, Henri pored over tomes, journals, and fragments forgotten even by the librarians who guarded them. He was looking for something, and after 12 years he found it. A set of papers, fused together by mould and age, hidden behind a false shelf in the royal census room. Most of it was indecipherable, but on one page, barely intact, there were markings. Not in Latin, not in French, not in any known language, but in a cipher nearly identical to the one used by Halwyn, the vanished scribe from King Alaric's court. Henri worked through the night. When he emerged the next morning, he was pale, shaking, His hands burned, literally blistered from the strange oils used to separate. To the sheets, but he held a translation, only 3 lines. The child is the gate is the wound, and the wound must never be named. No date, no author, just a thin, jagged hand, like someone had written it with trembling fingers or while in pain. Henri did not speak of it publicly. He sealed his notes, returned to the cathedral that had birthed his order, and resigned from every official post he held. He refused to answer the king's summons. He refused even to see his own students. Instead, he spent his final months carving something, a wooden box. Inside it, a single object, a child's crown, made not of gold but of ashwood and silver threads. On the underside, a symbol had been etched, a closed eye. When the box was found years later, it came with a letter, addressed not to any man, but to the keeper who comes after. The letter warned, do not seek the prince. He is not gone, he is not waiting, he is listening, and if you find him, he will remember you. The crown was quietly buried in a monastery crypt far from the capital. The box burned. But the legend survived. Because what Henri had discovered, what Halwyn may have died for, was this. The murder of Prince Theomund might not have been a murder at all. It may have been an invocation. Modern historians tend to dismiss these stories. They explain them as political metaphors, as coded critiques of royal overreach or allegories for trauma passed down through dynasties. But then there's the matter of the glass. You see, during renovations in 1949, workmen restoring the eastern wing of the palace uncovered a section of wall that had no doors but had once been framed for one. They opened it. Inside was a single windowless chamber. It smelled faintly of lavender, and the dust had not settled evenly. It gathered in circles, concentric rings, like ripples in water, radiating outward from the centre of the room, where a wooden chair sat facing a blank wall. On the floor, fragments of glass, finely crushed and glittering, almost like sand. Some claimed they were from a broken mirror, but analysis showed the fragments were not mirror glass. They weren't even modern. They were ancient, possibly pre-Roman, and fused into each sliver, microscopically, was a trace of silver nitrate, the same compound used in early photographic processes, as if the glass had seen something and never stopped recording it. No one knows where the chair is now, or the glass. The reports vanished from public record within weeks. A single black and white photo was leaked to a tabloid paper decades later, but the image was grainy and heavily redacted. Some say it was staged. Others swear you can see a shadow cast from nothing. But then came the final twist. In 2007, a private collector in Vienna purchased a bundle of old manuscripts from an estate auction, mostly 17th century ledgers and shipping records. Tucked between 2 unremarkable pages was a loose folio bearing a single sentence, written in the same cipher used by Halwyn and Henri. He wears a crown of silence, no name, no date, just a watermark, barely visible under ultraviolet light. A lion, eyes turned inward, watching something deep within. What if the murder of Theomund wasn't covered up? What if it was committed to cover up something else? Something ancient, something waiting. A gate, a wound, a silence that breathes through bloodlines and rituals and forgotten languages. A prince who was never meant to rule, but was chosen all the same. Because he was small, because he listened, because when the time came, he didn't scream. In the end, the case remains unsolved. The body never found. The motives never clear. But in the quiet corridors of history, behind the paintings, behind the names, behind the stone, something remains. A whisper, a chair, a silver key, and a child's voice, soft as ash, repeating the same words that first echoed down those ancient halls. Can I go home now? And the answer, if there ever was one, may be the most terrifying silence of all. The Queen who knew too much. They said Queen Isolde never smiled again after the disappearance of Prince Teomund. At first, this seemed understandable. A grieving mother, shattered by the loss of her only son, watching the walls close in as rumours swirled like smoke around the throne. She withdrew from court life, refused to sit for portraits, avoided feasts and ceremonies. No new children followed, no words spoken in public for nearly a year. But a closer look reveals something far more troubling. Queen Isolde didn't simply grieve, she investigated, in secret. Late at night, she would leave her quarters alone, descending into the lower libraries and forbidden wings of the palace, places even her husband, King Alaric, seldom ventured. Her ladies-in-waiting reported strange behaviour. She began reciting prayers in languages no one understood. She requested books that had been banned centuries earlier, and once she demanded a mirror be brought to her chambers, only to shatter it within minutes of its arrival. Her confessor, Brother Ewan, would later write in his hidden journals that the Queen was wrestling with something ancient, something she believes took her child not from the world, but into it. That phrase would become pivotal in later centuries. Because it wasn't just poetic grief, it was a theory, a belief, quietly growing among the few scholars who dared look deeper, that Teomund hadn't been murdered or lost, but transformed, not metaphorically, physically, permanently, and Isolde was determined to reverse it. She left letters, dozens of them. Most were burned by the royal archivists after her death, dismissed as the ramblings of a woman driven mad by loss. But 3 survived, hidden within a private devotional book in the Abbey of Eldon Rock, discovered only in 1973 during a routine cataloguing. They are brief, but damning. In one, she writes, he stands at the edge of dreams now. Each night he whispers a word I cannot remember when I wake, but it burns in my bones like a brand. I have locked the door, I have buried the key, but still he knocks. Another reads, I no longer fear death, I fear memory, for it is not the forgetting that is dangerous, it is the remembering. And the third, I did not bear a prince, I bore a gate, and I did not close it fast enough. These letters raise impossible questions. How could a 14th century queen speak of things that echo the findings of 20th century physicists, linguists, even dream theorists? How did she know the term gate in this context, centuries before it reappeared in Henry's translation? Some dismiss it as coincidence. Others see a thread, a through line of terror buried beneath the pageantry and prayer of medieval rule. Because not long after these writings, Queen Isolde vanished too. Not killed, not officially dead, but erased. According to the Royal Chronicle, she retired to a private estate in the north to live out her days in contemplation and peace. But no record exists of such an estate. No grave, no servant accounts, no shipments, no sightings, just silence. And yet, 6 years later, a traveller's journal surfaced in a coastal monastery in Dunwayne. The author, a merchant named Thomas of Vire, describes passing through a storm and taking shelter in what he believed was an abandoned hill cloister. Inside, he claimed, lived a single woman, pale as candle wax, eyes blackened with ash, hair white but not of age. She spoke not with lips, but with dreams. She offered no name, but he described her as wearing a faded royal pendant identical to the one Isolde wore in her final official portrait. He left the next morning, shaken, and never returned to the region. His final note, she is watching something no one else can see, and I believe it is watching her back. The implications are disturbing. Did Isolde discover something no one else could? Did she attempt to contain it? Did she succeed? Or did she disappear because she failed? We don't know. But her chamber door, sealed after her departure, bore a single mark carved into the wood from the inside. An eye, closed, the same symbol that would appear centuries later on the ashwood crown found by Henri de Law. the same symbol drawn in chalk by a child in a small Austrian village in 1892, found murmuring in his sleep, "He's under the stairs, he knows your name." The same symbol etched faintly into a shard of mirror recovered from the hidden palace room, microscopically but present. Over and over, an eye shut tight but never asleep. If this were only about symbols and stories, perhaps it could all be dismissed. But modern neurological studies have since confirmed that prolonged isolation, especially in rooms without windows, can produce consistent hallucinations across individuals, specifically the sensation of being watched by something behind you. And in the case of the Lost Prince, of the Queen Who Vanished, and of every room associated with their names, that same sensation has been reported independently for over 6 centuries. Is it psychological, residual, coincidental, or is it evidence of something deeper, something left behind by Theomund, or by what took his place? In recent years, some researchers have begun to revisit the case, not as a historical mystery, but as a pattern. They've noticed similar disappearances in unrelated royal houses. A child vanishes, a parent descends into obsession, an unexplained artifact remains, and always, somewhere in the background, a drawing, a fragment, a whisper, a crown, not of gold, but of silence. Isolde's story reminds us that grief doesn't simply destroy, it reveals. That in our most vulnerable moments, when power and love and the horror intersect, the world beneath our world begins to show its face. She wasn't just mourning, she was warning. And for those who still listen to the walls, who still see that closed eye in their dreams, who wake with a name in their mouth they don't remember speaking, that warning may still matter. Because the gate, once opened, never truly closes. It waits, it listens, it chooses, and perhaps, even now, it remembers you. The Secret Council. Most royal courts had secrets, but few had rooms dedicated to them. Beneath the eastern wing of Castle Elmswind, through a staircase long thought to have led to a wine cellar, was something far more troubling, a hidden chamber that appeared in no architectural plans, no treasury maps, no correspondence. Discovered only during the 1817 structural collapse of the East Tower, the chamber was made of stone unlike anything used elsewhere in the castle. Smooth, cold, veined with hairline cracks that pulsed, some claimed, faintly with heat. At its centre, a round table, carved directly into the floor, surrounded by 9 empty chairs. Above it, painted crudely on the domed ceiling, the same symbol once etched into Queen Isolde's chamber door, the closed eye. But it wasn't just a room, it was a meeting place. A place where, according to buried fragments of royal correspondence, a council met during the final months of Prince Theomund's life. They called themselves the Custodians, not nobles, not knights, not clergy. They were something else entirely, chosen by what no one could say. But their letters, barely surviving fire, mould and deliberate erasure, paint a picture of desperation behind the royal facade. These custodians believed the prince's disappearance was not only foreseen, but orchestrated, not by any earthly enemy, not by a rival kingdom, but by something older than the crown itself, something beneath it. Only 3 names survived from their records: Sir Alric of the Hollow Wood, a knight once stripped of lands for reasons never recorded; Lady Morena of the Shale, an herbalist who had been burned for witchcraft, but then pardoned and installed at court; and Brother Geron, a monk who took a vow of silence at age 11 and reportedly broke it only once, uttering a single word before dying: soon. They claimed the boy, Theomund, was not merely redshirned. Oil, he was a vessel, a receptacle for something that had waited generations for the right moment to awaken, and when it did, when it crossed the threshold of flesh and stone, even the highest throne would offer no protection. Their mission was clear: to contain the breach, not through force, but through memory and forgetting. One letter from Lady Morena is especially chilling. Written in a cipher that took scholars 3 decades to break, it reads, "He is not gone. He is elsewhere, between what we know and what we fear. A wound in the castle, shaped like a boy. We have done what we can, but it is not enough. He calls now. Another document, penned in the same strange hand found in the margins of Queen Isolde's last journal, refers to the custodian's most desperate act. The circle is drawn, the eye is closed, but the dream walks still. We don't know what this circle refers to, but the room's design, with its 9 chairs and inlaid table, suggests a ritual of containment, something ancient, symbolic, and perhaps unfinished, because carved faintly into the stone beneath one of the chairs was a crack, far too straight to be natural, as though something once escaped. After the chamber was discovered in 1817, it was sealed again by order of King Aldwin III. He claimed it was structurally unsound, but construction logs show that a full team of masons worked in secret for weeks afterward, not reinforcing the walls, but carving symbols into them. Symbols nearly identical to those found in Mesopotamian tombs, symbols later linked to early star charts and, curiously, to acoustic vibration patterns used in deep sound experiments centuries later. Why would a medieval secret council inscribe wave-based diagrams into a chamber supposedly built for secrecy, unless what they were hiding wasn't seen but heard? That leads us to the most disturbing detail of all. When researchers were finally granted access to the sealed chamber in 1994, they brought modern recording equipment. Not to document the structure, but to measure ambient sound. The room was perfectly silent at first, but as night fell, the microphones picked up something inexplicable. A low-frequency hum, subaudible, pulsing in intervals of 13 seconds, barely detectable, yet consistent. When digitally isolated, the waveform produced an image. It resembled an eye, closed, the same symbol, again. Skeptics dismissed it as coincidence or equipment malfunction, but then, 5 months later, one of the researchers, Dr. Alina Gorski, disappeared while presenting her findings in Prague. No signs of struggle, no financial motive, no reason to run. All she left behind was her notebook, opened to a single scribbled phrase, "He is dreaming again." Her voice was later found embedded in the final minute of the chamber's audio file, though she had not spoken during the recording. The words? I remember now. Are we simply tracing echoes? Are these stories of missing boys, vanished queens, secret councils, and humming rooms just layers of medieval hysteria reframed by modern minds hungry for meaning? Or are they fragments of something deeper, a pattern, one built not of politics or power, but of recurrence? Because every time the chamber has been reopened throughout history, something follows, a death, a dream, a silence that grows louder the more you try to ignore it, and it doesn't stop at Elmswind. Other hidden councils have been whispered about in other courts, across Spain, the Low Countries, the Polish frontier, always tied to disappearances, always linked to royalty, and always, somewhere in the documentation, the closed eye. Not a symbol of sleep, but of suppression, of something being held back, not for safety, but for our survival. The custodians believed it was possible to keep the breach from spreading, but only through deliberate forgetting, erasure. That's why so little remains. Not because time destroyed it, but because they did. Because knowledge, in this case, wasn't power, it was invitation. Now, with modern tools, we're beginning to reconstruct what they tried to keep buried. But the question remains, should we? Because if what they feared is real, if Theoman's disappearance wasn't just a tragedy but a transformation, then every discovery brings us closer to something we may not be able to undo. The table has 9 seats, 1 cracked, 8 remain, waiting. And in the silence that follows each closed door, each unsolved murder, each child who looks at you and says he lives in the ceiling, the council may be calling again, not to warn, but to witness. The last echo. In the dusty attic of the University of Renmere, a single box remained unopened for over 80 years. Labelled only E Registry 143, it had been misfiled among shipping manifests, its true contents unknown, until a graduate archivist cataloguing logistics records for a maritime thesis pried it open in 2021. Inside, parchment, brittle with age, dozens of them, some blank, some smudged with faded wax seals, and one, buried beneath the others, wrapped in lambskin, still damp to the touch despite the centuries. Its heading, scrawled in rust-red ink, read simply, "Account of the day the prince walked through walls." The handwriting matched that of Brother Geron, the mute monk who spoke only once before death. But the contents suggested otherwise. This wasn't a monastic report, it was something more intimate, a confession. The letter was addressed to no one. It began without salutation, no date, no signature, just words flowing across the page in a hand trembling but precise. We thought he was asleep. The Queen had sung to him, the nurse had placed the velvet around his feet, the priest had blessed the room, all was as it should be, and still the candle would not stay lit. He describes how the flames near the prince's bed always flickered inward, toward him, as if drawn by something within. He did not breathe like a child, he did not speak like one. When he looked at you, it was like hearing music backwards. Then, the moment of disappearance. There was no scream, no struggle, just a distortion. The walls bent, slightly, like heat over stone, and then he was not there. The author writes that the custodians rushed to the chamber, not to find the boy, but to seal what remained. They believed the prince had not been taken, but transformed, shifted. He passed through the veil, as if through silk. The room we stood in was no longer ours. The rest of the lure spirals into unstable language, sentences that loop, names that rewrite themselves, until the final paragraph snaps into painful clarity. We are not meant to remember, but I have failed. I dream of him now. He is taller, older, wearing robes not made by hands, and he says my name as if it were his. When they ask you what happened, tell them this. The throne was never for a king, it was a doorway, and we opened it. There it was, a direct claim that Prince Teomund did not die, but passed beyond. Not metaphorically, not in the poetic sense of grief or loss, but literally, through walls, time, or dimension, through some veil unknown to the physics or theology of any age. And the custodians, those strange hidden stewards of the secret, had known all along. Their role had never been to investigate, it had been to contain. But if so, why hide it all? Why erase the prince's name from records, burn the Queen's letters, build a false narrative of betrayal and royal scandal? Because belief is a contagion, and the custodians feared what would happen if even one generation believed too much. They saw what the prince became not as a miracle, but as a breach, a crack in the firmament of reality, a place where meaning itself could slip through and unravel. So they wrote lies. They built legends. They planted murders that never happened. They made us chase shadows. Because it's safer. Safer to believe a child was murdered by his mother than to believe he left. Safer to think a queen went mad than to admit she saw too clearly. Safer to bury the truth than to hear it calling. Yet here we are. Centuries later, the clues remain. The red wax seals on letters no one should have read. The impossible chamber beneath the castle. The humming frequencies that shouldn't exist. The eye that closes but never sleeps. And the dreams, always the dreams. Not just in Isolde's journals, not just in the monk's ramblings, but in modern researchers, archivists, historians, people who had never met, reporting the same vision after visiting the castle ruins. A boy, pale, smiling, standing in a hallway that stretches forever, whispering, "You came back." Coincidence? Mass suggestion? Or something worse? When this story first began, it was about a murder. An unsolved royal disappearance, a queen accused, a kingdom torn. But the more we followed the trail, the more the trail turned inward, towards secrets too strange to fake and too persistent to ignore. We wanted closure. We wanted justice. But what if there was no justice to be had? What if the truth was never buried, just folded into time, into memory, into the architecture of the castle itself? Waiting, watching, and when it deemed you ready, unfolding again. A few years ago, a historian placed a listening device near the spot where the prince's bed once stood. They were studying ambient sound patterns, not expecting anything. But at precisely 3:14 a.m., the recorder picked up a voice, just 2 words, barely above a whisper, "Still here." When played back, it distorted, the file corrupted, every copy melted into white noise, except one, a backup stored on analog tape. And if you listen closely, between the hiss and the hum, you'll hear it again, not "still here," but something deeper, something older, a name. Teomund. So now we ask, was it a murder? Was it a cover-up? Or was it something else? Transformation? A fracture in the story of kings and queens that split so cleanly, so quietly, that we barely noticed the world changing. In that silence, the court moved on. The wars were fought, the kingdoms fell, the names faded. But in one chamber, beneath stone and sleep, a circle remains, carved in secret, guarded in silence, unbroken almost. And if you've listened this far, if you've remembered what they tried so hard to make us forget, then perhaps in some way you've already joined the custodians, not to stop what's coming, but to witness it, and when it comes, to recognize the eye when it opens.